Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. I want to welcome you to this meeting of the Early Learning Council on January 27th, 2021. We appreciate all of the council members being here, as well as the staff who are joining us and the public who will also be joining us. And I'd like to start by asking our administrator, Remy, if she would please call the roll.
Yes. Angie Blackwell.
Here.
Katie Brooks.
She is coming.
Excellent. Peter Buckley.
Here.
Ann Kubish.
Here.
George Mendoza.
He's also coming after another meeting.
Dr. Peg Miller.
Here.
Clee Thorne Ladd.
Here.
Sue Miller, Chair.
Here.
And then we have our agency director representatives, Pat Allen, the Director of Oregon Health Authority.
Here.
Colt Gill, the Director of Oregon Department of Education.
Here.
Margaret Salazar, the Director of Oregon Housing and Community Services.
Here.
Welcome back. And Liesl Wendt, Deputy Director of Oregon Department of Human Services.
Here.
And lastly, I think we've already mentioned Miriam Calderon, Early Learning Systems Director of the Oregon Early Learning Division, is currently testifying in another meeting, and she will be here soon.
Great. Yes, thank you very much, Remy. Obviously, yes. People are being pulled in a bunch of different directions, and we know during a legislative session that gets even more intense for all of us, but especially for our agency directors. So thank you for being on this call and in this meeting for as long as you're able to join us today. As we get started, I just wanted to provide a really quick update at our retreat in October. You will remember we talked quite a bit about equity, how to make sure that's centered in all of the work that the council does. And so staff and I've participated in some meetings, interviewing a consultant who is going to probably come on hopefully by our April meeting and provide some support for us as we figure out how do we center equity in the early childhood system development. And thank you, Kali, for your recommendation of Tara. And then at our other half-day meeting, that's the other half of this meeting, February 10th, we're going to have our build consultants step us through some equity work. So we will be doing that, but it will be at our next half-day meeting. So at this point, I'd like to ask Angie Blackwell, who's one of our council members, as we all know, if she would provide some background, once again, in the essential understandings of Native Americans in Oregon. As we've said before, this is a document that tribal leaders put together over the past year, I believe working very closely with Colt and the Department of Education. And we're using that as the template for us increasing our understanding of the history of Native Americans in Oregon. So Angie, I'll turn it over to you, and thank you very much for your leadership.
Sure thing. Thank you, Sue. First, I want to say it's my honor to present these essential understandings at these meetings in lieu of land acknowledgement. And second, while I'm no expert on the matter, I am an enrolled member of the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde. And in addition to drawing from my knowledge and experience with my own tribe, it's my hope that throughout these months, that while we work through the essential understandings, there are 9 of them, that I can also include examples from the tribes in the areas in which you all live and work. So today's essential understanding is number 4, which is government. While I can only provide you a glimpse, I encourage you to visit the websites of the tribes in your area. Their documents are publicly shared on their website, so you can view constitutions and tribal ordinances and statutes if you so wish. So you can dig a little deeper if you like. Just remember, every tribe is different, and anything you learn about one tribe may not apply to the others. So starting with tribal government. The primary function of tribal government truly is to enforce and protect tribal sovereignty. And each tribe operates under its own constitution. Many of these constitutions are modeled after a template that was given to them by the Bureau of Indian Affairs after the Indian Reorganization Act of 1934. So these templates, while are very similar, there are details within each that each tribe defined for themselves. These templates do not take into consideration governing traditions that tribes held for millennia. So there are traditions around consensus building and who's at the table to make decisions. Those things are not considered in these constitutions, and many tribes across the country are looking at scrapping what's called the IRA, or Indian Reorganization Act constitutions, and rewriting their very own. So they could develop a constitution that's more based on their indigenous ways of knowing and their traditional ways of making decisions. So back to the ones that we have right now. These constitutions generally contain provisions for the general membership and the powers of the people, the powers of the elected body, which is typically named the tribal council, but some tribes have a different name. So for example, the Umatilla, the Confederated Tribes of Umatilla, call their elected body a board of trustees. Most of these elected bodies serve terms for 2 to 3 years. However, there are some variances in there. The Confederated Tribes of Warm Springs has 11 seats. 3 of those are reserved for lifetime appointments, 1 for the chief of each of the 3 tribes that their tribe represents. And the Constitution also holds the definition of membership criteria. This is a really big piece of sovereignty, is the right for each tribe to define for themselves who belongs and who doesn't. It's also the source of a lot of debate within tribes, and I think that's a perpetual one that's ongoing, probably for life. Anyways, back to the Constitution. Then a few more provisions in the Constitution include provisions for a judicial arm. And then, let's see, I'm sorry, I'm referring to my notes because I didn't want to forget anything. Judicial arm. And then provisions for amendment and how amendments are made to that Constitution. Some tribes have many, many amendments to their Constitution, and others have very few, like my own. So beyond the Constitution, tribes are governed by their own sets of statutes or ordinances. And again, these things are available on tribal websites if you're interested in knowing more. They range from anything from land management and environmental protections to employment rights and building codes, public safety, you name it, runs the gamut. So if you're interested in learning more about that, again, you can look at the tribe's websites from the area that you live in. And again, I want to thank the council for giving me this opportunity to share. And I don't think we have time for questions, but I'm always open to emails if you have any questions. Thank you. Sue, you are muted.
There we go. Thank you, Angie, very much. Great job. And I'm sure we all appreciate the fact that you pull in other tribal history and information. That's just adds to our understanding and our learning of the variety of our 9 recognized tribes in Oregon. So thank you very much. You enrich our meeting. greatly. Next on the agenda is public testimony. My understanding from Remy is that none has been provided. Okay, thank you, Remy. So we're going to now go to the updates, which has become sort of a traditional part of our council agendas. I know from feedback from all of you that hearing what our agency directors are prioritizing and involved in, as well as what's going on around the state in council members' regions, geographic regions, as well as the different networks that our council members represent, is a really valuable part of our meetings. So we're going to start with that. I want to just highlight, because it's such a great document, the Raise Up Oregon Progress Report, which you all have seen, hopefully. And as I said at the Children's Cabinet meeting the other day, the good news is it's 47 pages long because there's so much progress, and the bad news, it's 47 pages long. So, but I encourage you to read it. And it's very exciting to see what has been accomplished, much of it during COVID. So in spite of COVID, a lot of progress has been made in trying to build this system, and all of our partners are very committed to that and represented in that report. So we're going to do updates now, not related necessarily to the progress report, but just to what's going on, where are your priorities for the coming 6 months or 12 months for helping to build this system. And we're going to start with agency directors because I know some of them have to pop off. And Margaret, I think we'll start with you, Margaret Salazar, because I know you've got another meeting coming up. So we will start with you. Thank you for being here.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Sue, and nice to see all of you council members. I had the opportunity to give a brief update at the Children's Cabinet yesterday. Was that yesterday? I don't know.
Remember.
Anyway, so just quickly high level for you. We have been very focused over the last, obviously, 10 months on emergency response, as I know my colleagues here have been as well. And that has translated into significant amounts of rent and utility assistance, as well as wildfire recovery. I'm glad to see Liesl here. I know we've been working closely together on that. But certainly, it's really what it's meant is homelessness prevention. And deploying state and federal dollars on preventing homelessness, as well as standing up non-congregate shelter opportunities. That has been the major focus. And I did want to make this council aware, sort of breaking news, that on December 21st, we received, Oregon received a total of $482 million in new rental and utility assistance. $200 million of that was provided in the legislative special session. So it's state dollars, general fund, that needs to be expended by June 30. And then the federal stimulus package, the Consolidated Appropriations Act, also provided $282 million of federal rental and utility assistance to Oregon that needs to be expended by September 30th. So we will be very, very busy working with partners in all of your communities to get those dollars out. And OHCS will be administering about $200 million of the $282 million coming to our state. The rest is going to larger counties and municipalities. So that's a lot of what we're focused on right now, is that crisis response. Of course, in legislative session, we're also working to lift the governor's recommended budget, which is, again, another record proposed investment by the governor in housing and homeless services. Much of that sticks and bricks dollars to build out family-sized affordable housing units and permanent supportive housing, and a new focus on long-term rental assistance around youth aging out of the foster care system. And Oregon has one of the highest rates nationally, as I'm sure you're aware, of youth homelessness, unaccompanied youth. So that's an exciting opportunity to build on some of the work that's already going on. I did want to highlight one thing specifically for this council because of something that I heard Sue speak about at the Children's Cabinet. And she shared some language, which is that you all have really gone on record to ensure the availability of direct contracting with local and culturally specific organizations across all agencies as part of a strategy for deepening partnerships between the state and community-based organizations. I wrote it down and quoted it. Because we have a bill, I want to make sure is on your radar, a legislative concept to modernize the homeless services system in the state of Oregon. Our current homeless services system mandates that OHCS exclusively contract with community action agencies on a formula basis. And it builds in that the only entity to give us advisement on homeless services is the Community Action Agency Network. Now, community action agencies are doing heroic work, and they are delivering all of those rental assistance and utility services that I mentioned to you. But we also know that this is a bigger, broader interagency crisis. And as you all know, we have one of the highest rates of child and family homelessness in the country. So we really think that there's an opportunity to partner with this council to help deliver the message in the legislature about this bill, because what it would do is allow us to build in more community-based organizations and culturally specific organizations to advise on policy and program development, as well as be able to compete directly with the state for state resources, as opposed to having to enter into subcontracting contracts with community action agencies. So this is a shift. The majority of the dollars would stay with community action agencies to ensure continuity of services, but it would allow us around the edges to look at innovation, specialized projects and programs like child homelessness campaigns, and to work directly with community-based organizations. It also builds in, for the first time, definitions around culturally responsive services and culturally specific service providers. So it's a huge step in the right direction. So I just, Sue, wanted to highlight that for you, because my kind of light bulbs went off when you shared that. And I'd be glad to come back to this council with more details on that legislative concept as the language is finalized.
Awesome. Thank you, Margaret. So are you expecting a bill to be dropped that will, yes,
it's an agency bill. So we're finalizing the language now, and we have a public meeting with our Housing Stability Council tomorrow to preview the language, and I can send that link to this group, but there will be more opportunities to engage, and I can certainly walk folks through the language at your convenience.
Okay. Thank you, Margaret. That's very exciting, and we would appreciate learning more about that. And we'll talk about it at the end of our meeting today as well. All right, let's continue then with agency directors. Liesl, do you want to go for ODHS?
I do. Good afternoon. Thank you, Sue. And I'll start with kind of where Margaret touched upon with the state's fire response. It was going to be my last talking points, but I'll start there. We actually just presented to FEMA earlier today talking about our response and lessons learned. And I think one thing I just want to highlight, because I think when people are not in the impacted cities and counties, it may be out of sight, out of mind. But I think, as you all know, the fires this fall were devastating to many communities. But many people who were impacted were those who have the least resources, which is not new information to disasters, but definitely confirmed in this situation, particularly in Jackson County. We saw a large number of communities, Latinx communities, people whose languages were other than English. And I think we really saw our challenges to respond in leading with equity, and we're able to do some quick course corrections. But I just want to flag that I think that's an area for all of us to continue to invest with culturally specific providers who are on the ground in community and sometimes are better positioned to respond than state agencies. And credit to OHA for really leading with that, some of those investments to some of those organizations with the COVID response. So currently we are via hotels housing roughly 1,000 people a night. Still, I think if you think about traditional shelter operations after a disaster, you think of a convention center or a high school gym where there are cots and people reside there until there are intermediate or permanent housing solutions. Given the COVID environment, we have the direction to obviously not house people in congregate settings. And so that's been a challenge. And we're working closely with Margaret's team to figure out what some of those interim solutions are so that people can get a little bit closer to home and back to normal. We're also feeding those same families, in addition to other families who are not in hotels, but in other, sort of temporary shelter situations. So wanted to flag that. we're waiting to hear on a disaster case management grant from FEMA. And if we receive that, we'll be able to hire case managers on the ground in those local communities to help those families. And our focus right now is hiring bilingual, bicultural staff to partner with us on that effort. So that's kind of what's happening behind the scenes. I think with the other things I wanted to highlight, one of the partnerships with ELD in particular is House Bill 3073, which is an effort that Sue's mentioned a couple times before to create the Early Learning Authority. And for us in particular, that means taking the employment-related daycare program and putting it in this new authority. And so we're working closely with ELD to hire a contractor to help us really work through all of the details of what that would mean to move that program, really centering families' needs and wanting to have as little disruption to service as possible. So that's something we're closely paying attention to and working on.
I thought she was supposed to be overseeing the transfer of ERVC because really she's not doing anything.
What?
Yeah.
Here.
Someone's not on mute.
Someone is not right. Thank you.
Thank you. So that's one particular piece I wanted to share. There are some additional investments I think I mentioned last time in the governor's budget, one particular focused on equity. This is a $4.4 million investment and would do a number of things. One is help us rebrand the agency. We've informally shifted to calling ourselves ODHS, or Oregon Department of Human Services. So this would allow us to really partner with community and identify a name that is reflective of how community would like to see us and engage with us. So we're looking forward to that overdue effort. The other piece that is with that is rebranding the Oregon Trail Card. So our vision is to do the outreach together on both of those pieces. And the other is investing in our Office of Equity and Multicultural Services, which for a staff of 10,000 has only had roughly 10 to 12 staff. So looking forward to having staff that are in community, hearing from community and helping inform our efforts to focus on equity. And then I think the last one I'll just highlight for the sake of time is there is a significant investment in our child welfare program. It's a $4.6 million investment to create the Family Preservation and Prevention Program. You've all heard Rebecca Jones-Gaston, our child welfare director, talk about her vision for transformation, and that really the child welfare system is sort of small, and the system in Oregon to help families be successful is much larger than how we're currently structured. So this investment would help us develop and coordinate community-based prevention services for families and children. It has a quality improvement aspect to it so that we're constantly learning, growing, and adapting the program. And the goal ultimately is to increase the family access to community services locally, reduce the number of children in foster care, and really stabilize communities and families, which is, I know, a shared goal with the Early Learning Division. So I think with that, I will end and pass it back to you.
All right, thank you, Liesl. And it's you mentioning the revisioning for ODHS. I know from Rebecca's presentation at the cabinet meeting that it would probably be really helpful for all council members to receive that document that just so clearly identifies what you're hoping to do and how you're sort of going to reposition ODHS. So I'll work with Remy to get.
Well, and I'll see if in the next few minutes I can grab it and put it in the chat. So stay tuned.
Okay, thank you. It's a wonderful document. Thanks, Liesl. Let's next go to Colt and hear from Department of Education. Welcome, Colt.
Great. Thanks, Sue. So I think a lot of our priorities remain the same as they were from my last report. So we do continue to work on ensuring adequate funding and resources for our children who receive early intervention and early childhood special education supports. And much of that can be in partnership with the Early Learning Division for sure. And we have talked recently about establishing some new rules around the State Interagency Coordinating Council that supports the expenditure of the funds and the programs that are supported by IDEA Part C for early intervention programs. So continuing to work on those efforts. We also continue to be involved in the legislation related to the formation of the Early Learning Authority. and supporting that effort as well. As you're all aware, we did this school year temporarily suspend the kindergarten assessment, and really due to the impacts of COVID-19. We continue to be interested in rethinking that assessment in partnership with the Early Learning Division and the Council to better support students and their transition into the K-12 system into elementary school, and know that the kindergarten assessment has been named as a challenge as part and a barrier to some of that supportive and welcoming transition. So we'd like to continue to work in partnership on that effort and think about how we can make improvements to the kindergarten assessment, especially in areas of language and language limitations that the current assessment holds.
Yeah.
I think too that related to Raise Up Oregon, efforts to establish a shared cultural and practice between early care and K-3. We have a lot of work to do there. So we do still have, and I touched on this last time, but we have a legislation going forward related to social emotional learning and having that equity-centered approach to that work. And so we continue to seek partnership there. And that legislation is being introduced in the coming days, along with some other legislation that might be of interest. So we have legislation on access to linguistic inclusion for our students that helps our students earn credits and meet standards in language arts, regardless of the language that is attached to that language arts course. We also have some legislation being introduced next week related to supporting our LGBTQ2 SIA+ students, and some legislation related to our Native American communities in Oregon, tribal communities that wish to wear regalia and other objects of cultural significance at school events, and ensuring that schools honor that wish and allow that to happen. And finally, we have been working all year long on what we call our All Students Belong rule, which prohibits the display of hate symbols in school settings, whether online or in person. The legislature is also picking up that effort, so we'll be working closely with them to help to shepherd legislation related to the action of the state board on that matter. I think I'll stop there. Lots more, but oh, you're muted, Sue. Sorry.
There obviously is a lot going on, and certainly ODE is in the center of much of it. So thank you, Colt. Thanks. Pat Allen, how about OHA?
There's really not anything going on in particular to talk about or share.
Okay, we'll just move on.
Now we've got the next agenda item. So I think largely because pretty much all I do from waking to sleeping is think about the pandemic, and particularly right now vaccines. I thought I'd give a little bit of an update on that since it's particularly relevant. Through yesterday, we have in Oregon administered 340,000 doses of vaccine to 285,000 individuals. So that's about 235,000 first doses and 50,000 or so people who have completed both doses of one or the other vaccine. That's about 6.7% of our population. That's the 17th best rate in the country so far. And we're on a consistent basis administering about 12,500 to 13,000 vaccine doses per day. Our peak days have been around 16,000 doses per day. And that's in an atmosphere where virtually everybody who is providing vaccine is begging for more and unhappy with the amount they're getting because they could be vaccinating more people. It's on our end, it's a good problem to have, but what we really need is lots more vaccine. There are some signs of production beginning to increase, which is hopeful, and there are two new vaccines in the pipeline for approval. or nearing the pipeline for approval is probably a more accurate way to put it. In particular, one of those, the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, is a one-dose vaccine that doesn't require absurd storage conditions that make particularly the Pfizer vaccine so very difficult to deal with. Of particular note for this group, this week statewide and in some locations last week, we've begun vaccinating education, early learning, and childcare employees. That's about 150,000 people across the state. If all of them were to take the vaccine, we get about 60,000 first doses and about 60,000 booster doses per week in Oregon right now. So it gives you kind of a sense of the scale and time span for that. And we're administering these in a variety of ways across the state. You've probably read about the mass vaccination clinics at sites like the Fairgrounds in Salem and the Convention Center in Portland. Most of the rest of the state is doing that through local public health in partnership with local clinics or pharmacies or those kinds of things, because the scale is quite a bit smaller. The governor's decision to open this group up ahead of seniors has been quite controversial, as you can imagine. But in a pandemic, you're not faced with sort of on this side of the sheet are the good decisions and on this side of the sheet are the bad decisions. You're pretty much operating on that side of the sheet all the time. And what she did really was to balance the various competing goods and bads that come out of different kinds of vaccination strategies. And there are a lot of negative implications, not just educationally, but from a health standpoint, for kids not being in school. And what she really wanted to do was to protect childcare workers who have been providing childcare throughout the pandemic, and then vaccinate early learning and school employees to be able to have that facilitate reopening schools. When we talk about employees in these categories, a lot of times the shorthand of teachers gets used. It's really quite a bit broader than that. It's teachers, it's instructional assistants, nutrition services, bus drivers, pretty much anyone who's potentially going to come in contact with kids in that setting are eligible for vaccination now. It's going to be a challenge to get through that population before we open up to people who are 80 and older on February 8th. And like the existing population, what we call the 1A population, which are healthcare workers, people in long-term care, and others in congregate living like intellectual developmental disability, foster care, group homes, residential behavioral health, we're going to have to continue to work on basically kind of cleaning up those populations while we open to new populations. The 1A population is somewhere between 300,000 and 400,000 people. We've just added 150,000 people with this large education category. And then the population of people age 65 and older is about 700,000 people. And so we're going to have a similar experience to lots of the rest of the country, where we have a lot of people who are eligible for vaccine and not nearly enough to go around. We think it's going to take about 12 to 16 weeks to work through the population of seniors before we would be ready to move on any further than that. So, but I'm excited, both in my day job as the health authority director and in my hobby as the chair of my local school board, to have education employees now in the pipeline and working their way through getting vaccinated to help get schools open. So I think that's my update for the moment.
All right, thank you, Pat. And I know we all appreciate what you and all of your staff are doing to try to manage this as well as you can.
Thank you.
So thanks a lot. It doesn't look as if Miriam is here yet. Am I correct? She may still be at the Early Childhood Committee meeting. Okay. So let's go on then, and I think once Miriam joins us, she'll be with us for the duration. So I don't think she's going to have to pop off again. So council members, I think what I'll do is just go through the list alphabetically, just to kind of facilitate this update from your perspectives. And so Angie, let's start with any updates that you would like to provide, please.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Sue. So in Grand Ronde, my early childhood program is still only offering virtual services, but We are hoping to start, and I said this last time, I think, but we ended up getting delayed, but we're going to be doing small group in-person services starting sometime next month. As update, we are very fortunate that the tribe has begun vaccinating members of the educational staff. So my staff that want it have all been offered and received their first dose of the vaccination. So I'm very pleased about that. In other news, though, we are making progress on developing a partnership with WIC so that they can do in-person services in our building twice a month when we return to in-person services, and they do as well. We're very excited about that. And we also hired a full-time mental health consultant to work in education. This person will work 20 hours a week with my early childhood program for families with children birth to 5, and then 20 hours a week with our youth education program for children from 5 to 18. That's really exciting news. This is a play therapist that can work with our children, but also spend time in consultation with staff and parents without regard to billable hours. We had a mental health consultant before that worked with us, but not for us full time. And this is a really big jump in the right direction. We're also working with the LAUNCH program. Some of you may not be familiar with LAUNCH, but it stands for Linking Actions for Unmet Needs in Childhood Health, particularly mental health. And the LAUNCH program is a SAMHSA grant. It's a 5-year program. We're in year 3, and we're working with them to train all youth serving professionals in the tribe on conscious discipline. And we recently rolled that out to training community members and parents in conscious discipline. One other thing that we're doing with LAUNCH is streamlining childhood screening and assessments and trying to figure out how we can better share data across departments. So we're working with the pediatrician and behavioral health, our department, and a few other departments that work with children with disabilities, things like that. So that's a big plus too. I think that's all of the updates I was going to share today. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Angie. Exciting to hear that you might get some in-person class time back again in the near future. That's exciting. All right, going alphabetically. Peter, what's going on in Southern Oregon?
Oh, actually, doesn't Katie come before me? I'll jump over Brooks to go to Buckley if you want.
Oh, you're right. Actually, I'm reading through the agenda and it's not alphabetized. So if Katie doesn't mind, we'll go with you, Peter, and then go back to Central Oregon.
That sounds fine. So there's a lot going on. For anybody who's actually read through to see the theory of change for the hubs that we're going to talk about later on, that's really what we're doing in Southern Oregon, is following that. Our collaboration with Southern Oregon Success has all levels of education and healthcare and human services and public safety and workforce development in Jackson-Josephine County. And over the years, we've used the information from the Adverse Childhood Experiences study and the tools of resilience to try to get a common approach in our region. And that's really developed into a kind of accelerated pace of work where we've set a goal as a region that by 2025, all parents and caregivers in Jackson-Josephine County will have the knowledge, skills, connections, and support needed so all their children enter kindergarten ready to thrive. So we want to make sure our regional goal, was aligned with the Raise Up Oregon goal, aligned with our community health improvement plan. And from that goal that's been agreed to by the collaboration, of which your Learning Hub is a very key member of the collaboration, different work groups have evolved, and the ones that are currently operating are really looking at part of the systems change. We have a preschool K-12 alignment work group. It's going to hold 2 summits, one in April, one in August, to try to bring together early childhood educators with K-12 people and families to try to work on that transition from preschool to kindergarten. We have an early childhood supports group that's working to expand parent education and parent guardian peer support groups. In that group, for instance, when the fires hit here in September, there was a request from Migrant Education to see if we could establish some peer support groups for Spanish-speaking families that lost their homes to the fires. So we worked with La Clinica, with the Rogue Valley Mentoring, with Migrant Education, and now we have 2 groups going, peer support groups going with Spanish language facilitators. And we're looking to establish a partnership with the Family Independence Initiative, similar to what other counties in the state have through ODHS. We hope to start that this spring. We have a 3rd work group that is focusing on family voice, getting more stronger family voice across all sectors, developing a regional family advisory council, and a 4th work group that's working to have a school-based health center in every school in Jackson-Josephine County, with the idea being this is actually an equity issue as well, that the data is very clear that when students and families have access to care, their health outcomes are better, their attendance is better, education is better, and if families that are traditionally denied or have less access to health care have far more negative outcomes. So we're looking at school-based health centers as a way that anyone in the community could access. A mom with a 3-year-old with an earache could walk to her elementary school and have her child looked at a school-based health center. And also there'd be the centers would be a place to help navigate families into community resources. The CCOs have a mandate to create a community information exchange. We're working on we're already working on a kind of pilot of a closed loop referral system that we're going to merge with the CCOs, Community Information Exchange, hopefully to link up healthcare, human services, and education together, so there's no wrong door for a family to come through in order to access services. We also have a child care workforce work group that meets monthly. They're developing programs with our local high schools to develop a pathway for students who might be interested in a childcare job after graduation, and they are setting up internships with local childcare providers so that upon graduation they'll have a certificate that will allow them to be hired at a slightly higher pay level to work in childcare and in preschools. We also have a behavioral health workforce effort that's going on, trying to expand the number. It's the same across everywhere in the state as far as I understand. Our behavioral health workforce is severely depleted given the need. So we're trying to set up a system where anybody who has an interest in behavioral health, if it's a classroom education assistant, could take a course either through the ESD or through Southern Oregon University. It's a micro-credential course, so they get skilled up in behavioral health and kind of move up in terms of becoming a skills trainer, eventually becoming a mental health counselor, etc. So a lot of work is happening. We still have preschool promise slots open, like I think everybody else does. We're hopeful that as students are coming back to K-12, that more families will be interested in filling those preschool promise slots. So that's about it for Southern Oregon, Sue.
That's all?
We'll do something next month. We'll do something else next month.
Wow, that's breathless. And how exciting to hear about all of those cross-sector efforts and work groups that are underway. I think you mentioned all of our agency partners, plus some, and including up to higher ed, which of course is another partner that just isn't sitting at our table right now. But
it's taken a few years to get everybody to the table, but once everybody's been at the table, everyone's working hard together.
Yeah, that's exciting. Thank you, Peter. Thank you. Let's now go to Katie Brooks. A little bit out of order here, Katie. Sorry about that.
No worries, no worries. A few updates on my end. A lot of us are starting to open up the conversation about what recovery looks like. And as you all know, we tried to kick off a microcenter program here that just didn't go anywhere. We couldn't find a provider who was willing to head this up. So we put a pin in it. We're looking at the pin and thinking it's time. There it is. It's about time to start talking about it. So a couple of things are happening. East Cascade Works, which is our state WorkSource provider, is working on a pilot to identify and train folks who want to get in the childcare industry to get the labor force up and running, just like every other place across the state. I'm sure we have a huge deficit in folks who are working in this industry, and COVID just decimated the ranks. So we're trying to figure out that pipeline and get something going that's funded with some of the training and recovery money. I think that there are a few things that have worked pretty well so far through the pandemic. One is higher education, in particular OSU Cascades, one of our partners here, has a on-site childcare facility that they just started. I think it was in October or September for faculty. Ended up that some of it was for kids from faculty, but most of it has been used by the students themselves. They have maintained a hybrid format throughout the pandemic, and the students of OSU Cascades assessed a fee in order to pay for folks who could not afford it. So the students are paying for each other, which is really, really cool. And that's going quite well. Business community is starting to talk again about bringing people on board, beginning sometime this spring or whenever we get out of the extreme red light risk that Deschutes County is in right now with a lot of other counties across the state. I have been conducting one-on-one meetings for months with members, and the ones that businesses that have occurred lately, this is starting to come back on their radar screen. We have employees that we've enabled to work remotely. They're coming back. They have kids. We have no idea what we're going to do. So there's a lot of work to be done here. Other programs that have been running throughout the pandemic is with the High Desert ESD. They've been running after school and childcare programs with the Boys and Girls Club and some other partners, and really feel the need of low-income minority and underserved communities here. I don't know what we would frankly have done without that. So many people who had to work and had no choice and no money and nowhere to go. So that is still operating. We did have a COVID outbreak and had to shut down for a couple of weeks and had some backup plans, but it was really rough until the isolation period was over. So the challenges are still here. There's still recognition that we need to actually have a plan on the ground. And one of the things that is complicating it for new childcare in Central Oregon and specifically Bend is that our commercial real estate prices have gone up something like 20%. We have I think 0.2% unoccupied space. We have around 80 to 90% of our new leases being from companies that are out of state. So it's mass exodus. We got on everybody's radar screen, and it's extremely hard to get commercial space here. And it's going to make it really difficult for folks to reopen and start anything new, because we all know the economics of childcare specifically is upside down to begin with. So I'm starting to worry a great deal about that as well. Not as happy as you, Peter.
I can't believe it. Commercial space. That's horrible. That's horrible.
I know it's an anomaly. The rest of the country, you talk to commercial realtors, and it's the opposite. They're trying to keep their tenants and trying to keep them in business. Here, they're kicking them out.
Oh my gosh.
California, Boston, Seattle, Austin, from all over the place are just clamoring to get in to Bend, and it's taking up all the space.
Wow. This is a diverse state for sure.
Yes, it is.
Okay.
That's all I got.
Katie.
You
Yeah.
bet.
And I know Katie has to jump off in a little while to go to the Early Childhood House Committee and talk about the same topic. So thanks for being a great representative, Katie. I'm going to keep going through the lay council members, as I refer to us. And Miriam, I'm saving you for last so that you can have whatever time is left, and it should be more than at the cabinet meeting. You'll be glad to hear. But also so you can maybe do a little bit of cleanup from some of the issues that you're hearing us talk about. So welcome to the meeting. We're glad you got out of the other meeting.
Thank you.
And next, let's go to Ann Kubich in the Roseburg area.
Hi, thank you, Sue. Good afternoon, everyone. I will be quick. I'll just make a couple of points. I think where we are here is we've had so many back and forth about, are the schools going to open or not open, and for whom? And yes, we're going to do it for young kids, but no, and then we have to close. And so I think everybody feels like they're just on a kind of a roller coaster and have no idea how to plan. And that is so unsettling. One of the things that our foundation has done is that we've actually provided some funding to the Douglas County ESD to hire some nurses, because it's turning out that they feel that nurses are the ones who can actually be out and in touch with students. And so we provided some funding, and they've hired, I think, 2 or 3 nurses to be in touch with all of the schools in the districts and the families there, which we hope is keeping kids and families connected and healthy. But I think overall, our general sense in Southern Oregon and in rural Oregon in general is there's a real concern about the ongoing nature of COVID, that a lot of the businesses and a lot of the nonprofits that felt like they could just make it through 2020, if we could turn the corner, if we could get those vaccines out, we can just live through it, and we have our PPP and we figured it out. But now I think at this point, through the middle of this winter, we're seeing businesses close permanently. And those are the sources of income for a lot of our rural residents. You know, in the area of food, for example, I mean, in the food production side, we're doing okay, but on the food service side, a lot of those businesses are just closing, and they're not going to reopen. And this is going to have long-term impact on our workers, on our communities, and our kids. We're also particularly concerned about the Latinx population, both in terms of the impact on COVID, but also the wildfires. And there's a lot of work that needs to be done to reach out to the Latinx population, especially undocumented ones, and who don't feel like they can get the supports that they need. Which brings me to the effects of the wildfires throughout rural Oregon. I mean, Peter, you're in the middle of it, and you all have it more than anybody, but the incredible cost that this has to our Oregon communities, and the amount of work that it's going to take to recover is just unbelievable. And what we as a foundation are doing is finding, I think, 3 places for us to be helpful. And I'd be interested in, I'd love to talk with Liesl a little bit about some of this too, because so one thing is that in terms of community response and making sure that communities have access to all of the needs they have, there's a kind of a central organizing role that it's hard to, that nobody's really playing. I mean, there's some groups that are trying to play it, but it makes it very hard for the communities to come together and develop coherent systems of supports. Which means that it's also hard for case management to actually happen. And there's a lot of people who feel like they're not getting access to the resources and still don't know where to go, that we're trying to work on. And then of course, all of these communities are traumatized. And so we need some trauma-informed care for these communities. And then I'll just end by saying that in Roseburg, we're really trying to resuscitate our efforts to bring the entire community together around childcare. We are developing an integrated strategy that is about the providers. It's about bringing the schools in, bringing the business supports in, and so on. Our CCR and our early learning hub is based in our education service district in our ESD. And our CCR&R, which used to be based at our community college, has now gone to our ESD. So there's some institutional movements that might begin to help some of this coordination, but I think we're getting the business community, the nonprofits, and the support organizations starting to feel like they can come together for some kind of comprehensive and integrated childcare strategy for Douglas County. And I will stop there. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you, Anne. Yes, you're right. The impact of those fires are going to be with us for a long, long time. So, and thanks for all that the Ford Family Foundation is doing to try to address some of those needs. We appreciate philanthropy a lot. Next, let's hear from George and what is happening over in La Grande or Central Eastern Oregon.
Sorry, everyone. A lot of things are going on. I guess LeGrand School District is now back K through 12, and we've had our K through 6 back in our schools once we returned from winter break. And today is our first day of having 7th grade through 12th grade back. One side note is our boiler broke down last night at the high school. Now, LeGrand is cold if you've ever been to LeGrand, especially this time in January. And we finally got the boiler to work somewhere near 9 o'clock. So it wasn't the best first day, but we're going forward. We've been doing a really good job of managing COVID in our school district. As a matter of fact, in the last 2 weeks, we had 4 cases total, and it was children having COVID, none of our staff. And then we've gotten really better at close contacts and avoiding close contacts as well, and creating that separation and space in our school district as well. So you can operate schools safely, and you can implement a lot of the key practices and move forward. And that's what's going on in my region, in Union County and Baker County and Wallowa County, and a lot of these rural areas. They've been able to have students in their schools, and now it seems like, at least the counties that I just described, most folks have their K through 12 back, at least with the larger school districts in a hybrid schedule that's an A day, B day. So the logistics of that, I will say, get a lot of my attention, get a lot of my time. You start getting into operations also with club sports and activities. You get into the mental health and the behavioral health and all the support that you need to do for students that are coming back. We've been doing a variety of different trainings as well on equity and access in our own school district, starting with our board and with our administrative leadership team. This year we just started as well. About in the end of December, we had Eastern Oregon University Head Start move into one of our classrooms in our school district. So we now have an extra site for Head Start, basically 20 slots. We're now also working to update 2 of our modulars in our school district and to make them into early learning center locations for those the Head Start classes. So we're just moving forward, but I would just say that back to in-person education, preparing ourselves for that has gotten a lot of my attention and a lot of our educators' attention in our school district. Oh, and vaccine. I guess I heard that as well. We've been vaccinating our staff. We had the opportunity around 2 weeks ago to start with our special education staff that worked with students that have life skills. So students that are that have high dependent care needs, and staff that work with them that hopefully, of course, address their health needs, were given the opportunity to start around almost 3 weeks ago. And now we've had the vaccine available to our school district as of last week on Friday. And we've slowly have had, so far that I know of, 90 educators in our school district. We have about 315 employees, and about 90 have had access to the first dose of vaccine. And just organizing that has been a lot to do to get that to happen.
Yeah. Well, congratulations, George, on getting the schools open. That's obviously a priority for everybody if it can be done safely. So yeah. Nice going. Kali, what is going on in your world?
Hello, colleagues. I'm amazed that they're reopened. I think it just is a testament to the diversity of the state and how different parts of the state are. In the metro region, there's actually a lot of concern, I would say, particularly from Black and Brown communities about reopening. The one, I think that I have concerns, and I know others do, around mental health and support, and whether schools are prepared to deal with what will come with reopening, because there is a lot of anxiety on many different levels. There are a lot of, I would say, in the Black community, multi-generational families. And so children are anxious about going to school because they live with their grandmother, they live with an older adult, and it doesn't feel safe. We don't have vaccines to everyone yet. There's also concerns about the vaccine, and that's a whole nother issue. But there's a lot of concern about being able to get children back in school and know that they're going to be supported through all of the social, emotional, mental health issues that come with returning to an environment with a heightened anxiety on many levels. So I think there's work to be done here still. And I know that many community-based organizations are trying to figure out the role that CBOs play in supporting this transition and supporting the families, the importance of partnership in this, and districts not trying to go it alone. I think there's also, we're seeing higher incidences of gun violence than we've seen in the last decade. There have been over 60 shootings in Multnomah County in the last month alone. And this is youth killing youth. It has a very high impact on Black and brown youth. And so there's also no community safety plan around if this is happening with kids sequestered at home. And so when you're talking about reopening, what other, how are you ensuring, and I testified before Senate Ed Committee this week about, or last week about this, like, how are you ensuring children are safe? There's people dying that are, innocent bystanders. Like there's not really a community collective conversation around how do we protect our children during all of this. I think the other thing that we see, particularly again for Black and brown communities, there's higher incidences of death. So there's a lot of people that know people that have died. Many people have lost multiple people in their families. Like the stress of all of this is, I can't underscore enough. And so between that and the violence, there's just a lot going on. And I think there's just concern about how we provide the supports necessary. On the policy side, there are a number of measures that I've been involved with other members of the community that deal with equity as it pertains to children in education. And so the early learning ones, there is efforts to ensure that there's more reporting on disproportionate discipline, and also trying to implement more restorative practices. Senator Denbrough has been looking at that. I think he wants to also establish a committee to look at this. They're looking at it both in K-12 and in early childhood. How do we deal with disproportionate discipline given, and this is coming out of sort of post-BLM, not post, but the height of it. How do we ensure that we're not creating pipelines to prison with children starting in early childhood? And then I think the only other one is a lot around the workforce. And there was, some of you may have heard the OPB interview today talking about how teachers are so woefully underpaid in early childhood. It's a conversation that's coming up at almost every policy table that I find myself in. The report that they were interviewing on said Black teachers are amongst the most poorly paid. All of them are poorly paid though. And so I think there's a lot of concern of how do we deal with this workforce issue. And of course, that the region passed a preschool for all measure in the last election. And so they're preparing to roll that out. And the workforce piece of that is important, as well as we're trying to create this system where all children have access to quality early childhood. How do we ensure that the people that are working for them have that too? I think the other thing I've heard is some of the Head Starts and early childhood programs that are serving kids of color. It's sort of the same thing. There's many Head Starts that have not opened, and many of the Albina Head Starts have not opened because 60% of the staff are Black or Latinx, and they're concerned about their safety from a health standpoint. And so, and same with some of the smaller home-based care. And so again, what we see throughout the system is how do we protect those who are vulnerable, knowing that underlying conditions are more predominant in certain groups than others. And I think the early learning space has taken a huge hit. And so a lot happening, to say the least. I think there's hopefulness with the vaccine. I think we need to do more awareness. There's definitely varying viewpoints on the safety of the vaccine. I can only speak really within the Black community. There are definitely multiple schools of thought, and I don't know percentages of like what percentage of people really believe in it and what don't, but there is definitely a faction of folks that feel like they don't want to get the vaccine. And that's, I think, a bit of an issue. I wonder about public education. I know that there have been some forums that our regional health hubs have done, but I honestly don't know how to overcome the challenge. I've had personal debates with people, and I don't know how to change hearts and minds on that one, but that's another issue given all these other things that are going on. So that's my little report.
Okay, thank you, Kali. And hopefully we'll have time to come back to that later in our meeting. And I'm not sure how long we'll have Pat with us, but he may well have some information about the last issue you brought up, which is how to talk about the safety of the vaccines. So let me jump now to Miriam. Welcome, we're delighted to have you here and look forward to whatever updates you want to provide, Miriam.
Thanks, Sue. Great to be with everyone. I think Katie and I just switched. I came from Early Childhood Committee. So I guess I'll start first with COVID response. And I didn't get to hear everybody's overview, so I don't want to be duplicative. I think top of mind right now is certainly this week is vaccinations and our work with the Oregon Health Authority and local public health agencies and our childcare resource and referral entities to get out the right kind of, the right information. So early childhood educators and providers, caregivers became eligible for the vaccine starting Monday. I can definitely share some memo that we provided to OHA and counties, which gave estimates of both who is in this priority 1B category and it is broken out by county. And so that was really made available to help counties be able to plan right across this time frame in this 1B category of childcare providers and early learning educators. How many vaccines per county, are we talking about? So those were estimates for planning purposes. As we've shifted to this week, there's a lot of obviously interest in where do I go? How do I get the vaccine? How do I schedule? So, really, and Pat, please, jump in here if I'm overstating anything. Both at first, it's saying anything correctly. There's really now, I think, kind of the main headline is there are really every county is really in a different place about how and when. Some counties started before Monday with early childhood providers and educators. Some are just starting. I think particularly in the last 36 hours, what has been stood up has been a particular a specific system for the Tri-County area and caregivers and educators in the Tri-County to be scheduled for vaccines. And then every other, community and county is sort of in a different place. So what we've done at ELD is make the information available. We've worked with ODHS and provided information to local public health about how to contact providers, including our DHS subsidy providers that are license exempt. We've suggested they work with R&Rs and there are different local strategies, I'd say, for county. In some places, you might be hearing before ELD or OHA knows around what the vaccine event is or the plan or what percentage of this workforce they've vaccinated. I think one important message, and I'll move on from this in the interest of time, is just to say it is going to take several weeks to reach all of our caregivers and early childhood educators. And anything, as you're looking at your own plans, your county public health websites, OHA has created a centralized landing page for early childhood educators to look and people to be able, community members to find out about local vaccination events. We have all that information on our COVID-19 page. I think where I was in a call with R&R directors this morning, we really want to hone on our resources, licensing, R&Rs, community partners, really thinking with our equity lens. We need to do more to reach providers who aren't going to get this information, because they regularly check email or have an email account or have internet access or a computer or speak languages other than English. There's a lot of information I know that's being put together with community partners and OHA to support particular caregivers who speak languages other than English to learn about these vaccination events. But I think that kind of assistance is really needed. And again, can't stress enough. It's very local and varied by community in our state. And we are in the first week of a multi-week effort, I think, to really be able to realize the vaccines for all of our caregivers. Related to COVID response, a couple of other quick things. We did roll out amendments at the start of the year, some minor changes, and then some other updates to exclusion and quarantine criteria for COVID-19, early care and emergency childcare facilities that are open and operating. We've done a round of provider calls. We're doing some tonight, both OHA and ELD with some senior health officials. We're going to really focus on vaccinations tonight as well. Some of the interaction between I got my first shot, but not my second shot, and I have symptoms, and what does that mean in terms of exclusion and quarantine is some of the things that we're talking about. We're also trying to prepare, caregivers and providers to understand side effects, to understand safety, I think as Kali was talking about. So I think those are recorded and posted if you can't attend one of those on the COVID-19 page, but I think it would be interesting, can help amplify, see what, OHA and ELD is sharing around that. We'll continue to support that. And then I do one Saturday mornings in Spanish as well. And we'll be joined by a Spanish speaking senior health official. We're very excited as well to be working with OHA and Oregon and OHSU to be able to launch a nurse consultation line for childcare providers that OHSU will be hosting, and this will be statewide. They'll be tapping into interpretation resources, so it's open to a wide range of languages. And this is being supported through some of our federal CARES Act dollars and this partnership so that childcare providers will be able to get access to a nurse to be able to help them understand symptoms, answer questions around vaccines, exclusion, quarantine criteria. So we've been working on that for quite a while. So it's exciting that we are, maybe about a week and a half away, hopefully, don't want to jinx it, from being able to launch that for all of our early care and education providers. We also continue to work very closely with ODHS as part of COVID response on the ERDC policy changes. So keeping those going, continuing to track what the budget implications are for continuing to pick up pay copays for all families in ERDC, increased eligibility requirements, and those policy changes that we've discussed before. Right now, those are in effect through March, both from a budget perspective as well as our federal waiver. So but our goal certainly is to be able to prioritize keeping these policies in place through the duration of the emergency, whenever that state of emergency ends. We've also started to do some really interesting work, I think, on transition planning for when we have to sort of transition out of these emergency subsidy policy changes. What does that look like? Because, a number of these, particularly on copays, have really advanced goals that we've had a long time in our state around sort of more affordable copays. We did receive, we haven't received yet, let me correct. There is an additional federal funding coming to our state through CCDF to support childcare providers, about $100 million roughly, that we now have to spend to be able to support early care and education providers. And we are going to be doing some engagement and talk around priorities there. What are the next sets of priorities that we have to be able to support childcare through the recovery. I'll say just a couple of other quick things. I think it's been touched on already. SSA implementation, the exciting expansion that we had, last session of early learning opportunities for children and families. We know, and I think it's been touched on here, Head Starts have had to switch to virtual or hybrid options in many parts of our state. Similarly, with some of our preschool promise providers, there's been, staffing issues that have arisen. Many of our equity fund providers, a lot of folks have really had to, home visiting programs have had to adapt service delivery models during COVID, or maybe having, challenges with, connecting with families, being fully enrolled. We are continuing to kind of assess that and, really want to be very flexible with providers and really understand that, this, we were in the middle of a big expansion and I think a lot of change as this pandemic hit, and including some of the things that were delayed were also a lot of the supports and technical assistance that needed to be in place, or, or some things like coordinated enrollment, say for Preschool Promise, were very nascent. So there's a lot that has been impacted by COVID. So I think a lot of this is really, what can we learn from what happened, including during this year, which has really been kind of somewhat of an anomaly around, this, how we wanted expansion to go in the middle of a pandemic, that we can begin and to improve our practices and really think about implementation next year, right? As we get ready for another cycle, hopefully, of continuation grants for these services. Session, I'll say really quickly, legislative session is also top of mind right now for ELD. There are a lot of really thoughtful childcare bills that we're seeing and currently doing our bill reviews on. So that's really exciting. We know it's increasingly, I think, a priority for so many legislators, and we know for our governor. I know governance has been touched on as well. So as we look to the governor priorities and other key priorities, governance bill legislation is something that we're tracking. We're really excited as well about the governor's proposed investments, more expansion and those opportunities, a new investment in building capacity around suspension and expulsion, resources in our state, and is preventing suspension and expulsion in early care and education settings. Is something that I know Khalid touched on. So the governor does have a new investment, and we're really looking at all the different tables and bills as well as investments opportunities to be able to see that through. And I think the final thing I'll say is rule promulgation, both as we think about, we've got to kind of begin to think about all the other work that needs to happen and move, and rules is certainly, I think, on deck for us to kind of continue to talk about with you as a council. There are some, I think, priority sets of rules as we think about just our programs and how do we look at rules to update them and revise them. But then we've also got some really, I think, big opportunities and rule sets, major work when we think about beginning to pick back up the work of the child care rule revision process. I think at one point, for those council members or those of you who were tuning in before, at one point, I think that was referred to as the big kahuna or something, but it's we want to pick back up that work around child care rules. It was also a recommendation in the child care task force report. The governor has asked us to look at unified preschool standards that address equity across all preschool settings that receive public funds. So that is work I think that we will do with the, and we'll have more opportunities to talk about this, I know, with the State Board of Ed, as well as some exciting opportunities, I think, to look at equity issues in our early learning guidelines and racial identity and other work. So big thing when we think about rules, standards, early learning guidelines, I think a lot to look forward to in 2021, and we're preparing some of that work now.
All right, thank you, Miriam, very much. And I know there's lots more we could talk about, and we'll hit legislation again later in this meeting. Two things. Remy just told me that I skipped over Peg Miller for updates. So Peg, I don't know if you're on or seeing a patient.
I just actually got back. just real quickly, you know, my concerns are with the low numbers of reports we're getting as far as child abuse is concerned. And we know that in times of crisis like we're in now, that child abuse doesn't go down. And because gun sales and alcohol sales are up, likely, and poverty is up, as is unemployment, likely child abuse is up as well. And I think Kelly hit on it, when we really have to be ready to support those families as we sort of get back into school and so forth, and those kids become more visible to us, so that we're supporting childcare and education, as well as the child abuse assessment centers, because I think we're all going to kind of feel that flood. I've been attending this week a virtual international child abuse meeting, and lots of talk about trauma-informed care and trying to build resilience in kids. And I think, you know, we all want to look at the silver lining of what can we take in a positive way from COVID, and probably how to build resilience in kids in these times, I think is really important. And certainly looking at historical and racial trauma as forms of trauma, not just what the child's experiences in the current setting have been, but to look at that from a family perspective and a historical perspective. And I think for all of us, including healthcare, to be really aware of that is going to be important going forward, and certainly has been one of the themes of this international meeting. Locally, you know, we're working to support childcare. We're able to fortunately raise money through our nonprofit Relief Nursery to build a new building out in the West Valley for a new relief nursery out there. And the need is high out there. That's one of our highest areas of child abuse and neglect and substance abuse in families. So that's an optimistic thing. We are kind of, the other hat I wear is an advocate for children with special healthcare needs in our community. And, you know, that's another area that's really underserved right now in the range of COVID, because these are families that have really depended upon schools and services and early intervention and so forth. And even assessments aren't being done. If kids are having their well visits done, then the assessments, which in our county are done through the ESD and early intervention, are not being done. So hopefully by getting back into school, and, you know, we're working towards that, that we can help to alleviate some of those problems. But I really do think the need is going to be in social emotional support for families and kids as we come back into this. That's about all I have.
Okay, thank you very much, Peg. And I apologize for skipping over Miller. Okay, we are a little behind, so we're going to now switch to our presentation. And I've asked Pat Allen, before he has to jump off the meeting, if he would just introduce and sort of frame up this conversation for us. Thanks, Pat.
Sure, thanks, Chair Miller. So this presentation is on early childhood mental health incentive metric for coordinated care organizations. You'll remember that CCOs are the 13 or so organizations through which we deliver Oregon Health Plan services, which cover about half of all kids in Oregon. A percentage of their compensation is at risk based on their achievement of various quality metrics. The idea being that that's what keeps CCOs from ending up looking a lot like managed care back in the early 90s, where, you know, the best way to manage costs was to not give anybody care. And so we use these quality metrics to drive high quality care and various policy initiatives. And so this is an update on the glide path toward the kindergarten readiness metric for CCOs. Social and emotional skills are considered to be the top issue for kindergarten readiness by a multidisciplinary group. that was surveyed about school readiness a number of years ago. I'm really excited about the work that that's going on because it's galvanizing action within the healthcare system and incentivizing improvements around social emotional health for kids birth through age 5. It's really focusing on the notion that the health and healthcare system has a profound impact on kids' earliest years and their ability to be successful in school going forward. The work helps the health system be accountable for what they can contribute when it comes to social and emotional development of kids. This process has been collaborative with the Early Learning Division, recognizing how closely tied our work is with ELD around kids. And with that, I'm going to introduce and turn the presentation over to Colleen Ruland, who's the director of the Oregon Pediatric Improvement Partnership, and Elena Rivera with the Children's Institute, who have led the work in partnership with our metrics team.
All right, thank you, Pat, very much. Appreciate that. And Colleen and Elena, welcome. We appreciate you being with us. Sorry, we're running a few minutes late, but we still have time for your presentation and some Q&A. So thank you. We're excited to get updated.
Fabulous.
And fun to see you again.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the introduction, Director Allen, and for the warm welcome. I'm going to share my slides. Can folks see the slideshow?
Yes, we got it. Thank you.
Okay, excellent, excellent. Well, yeah, as Director Allen shared, Colleen and I are here today to share about the health aspects of kindergarten readiness measurement strategy for CCOs, and in particular to give you an update on a system level measure really focused on addressing young children's social emotional health. So I work with the Children's Institute as the Senior Health Policy Advisor, and I'm here presenting with Colleen.
Hi, and as Pat mentioned, I'm the director of the Oregon Pediatric Improvement Partnership. We do work across the state to improve the health of children and have an opportunity to work across all of the sectors that you're focused on in the Early Learning Council.
And so today we'll cover a little bit about the background of our efforts in Oregon and the real impetus and momentum that's been building for this opportunity. And then we'll focus on an update on this social emotional health metric and share a little bit about what progress we've made, how the metric itself works, and what our plans and next steps are. Make sure to leave a little time for a discussion and questions. So where have we been? As as I alluded to, this is really a growing opportunity that's been building over several years. So thinking back to all the way several years ago when Oregon was launching its early learning system, and we were also launching the CCO delivery system. These early learning and health system reforms laid a real foundation and a vision for collaboration that our early learning system and our healthcare system could really work together meaningfully to support young children and their health and well-being. And thinking at a regional level as well, having regional early learning hubs and regional CCOs to be able to coordinate and drive a lot of efforts. And so from that point, there really launched a discussion around measurement in particular, and could there be a set of measures that could really drive and track progress toward this kind of meaningful cross-sector collaboration? So there was an initial work group back in 2015 that wrestled with that question. And since then, the vision and the support and the leadership has just been building. So we know that young children are a priority for Governor Brown, thinking about the 2018 Children's Agenda and the focus on young children's health and well-being across various systems and sectors. The Oregon Health Policy Board recommendations for CCO 2.0 have really key elements focused on young children's health, including behavioral health and health equity. And then, of course, we have Raise Up Oregon, our early learning system plan, which calls for really deep cross-sector work in support of children and families. So all of these efforts we see really being the backdrop for this work. And so zooming in a little bit to think specifically about the health sector's role in kindergarten readiness, Oregon's been leading some innovative work to explore this question. And so we know that Medicaid covers about half of all children in our state. And so we've had this question of what is the role of our CCO delivery system in driving progress and being accountable to supporting children's earliest life health and development in support of kindergarten readiness. We also know that, as Director Allen alluded to, CCO accountability metrics, and in particular those that are financially incentivized, have been shown to just drive dramatic improvements in access and outcomes. And so that's a significant lever that we have in our state that's really unique. And this question of the role of CCOs and CCO incentive measures is what launched a partnership between Children's Institute, the Oregon Pediatric Improvement Partnership, and the Oregon Health Authority. Together, we convened a cross-sector work group called the Health Aspects of Kindergarten Readiness Work Group back in 2018. The work group held this vision that all children would arrive at kindergarten with the skills, experiences, and supports to succeed. And this definition actually comes from the 2015 Early Learning Strategic Plan, just because we were really wanting to be intentional throughout our process about building alignment with the early learning system. Though this is an effort focused on healthcare, how could we be driving toward alignment across our systems? And so this work group was charged with recommending CCO incentive metrics that could drive significant change and quality improvement to support kindergarten readiness and build toward that collective action. The work group developed a 4-part measure strategy that we recommended to the Metrics and Scoring Committee, which has ultimate decision-making authority over CCO incentive measures. And the 4 metrics really span children's physical, oral, social, emotional, and developmental health, an acknowledgement that it is really whole child development that needs to be focused on if we want to see improvements in kindergarten readiness. And so we've made substantial progress since the work group wrapped up at the end of 2018. We received unanimous endorsement from the Metrics and Scoring Committee and real strong support as well from the Health Plan Quality Metrics Committee, which is another important decision-making group. And the first 2 metrics we recommended, preventive dental visits and well-child visits, have already been adopted as CCO incentive measures. There's been a lot of support secured to develop the 2 new measures, this social emotional measure and a 4th measure looking at follow-up to developmental screening. And this is where we find ourselves today. We want to really focus in on this social emotional health metric. We're really grateful, as Director Allen mentioned, for the partnership with the Early Learning Division as well. David Mandel has been deeply involved in just ensuring that we're making multiple connections and staying closely aligned with Raise Up Oregon and other efforts underway at the Early Learning Division. And so I wanted to zoom out and think about why we're focusing on children's social emotional health. You all on the Early Learning Council, this won't be a surprise to you, but the families who we spoke with as part of our engagement process for the work group we convened all identified social emotional health as the top priority for them and a really important contributor to kindergarten readiness. And so therefore, this area was the top priority for the work group members as well and other stakeholders they engaged. It's this area where there's a clear role for the healthcare system and also where families and stakeholders and work group members spoke really clearly about several health system barriers that exist to ensuring that children with social emotional health needs actually get the support and services and connections that will support their social emotional health. And we've seen this persistent lack of social emotional supports for children with needs, even though we've had a strong focus within our healthcare system around integration of services, patient-centered primary care homes, and several other really incredible community-based efforts focused on young children. We also know the COVID-19 pandemic has just enhanced the urgency of this issue, and we're attuned to that and how the pandemic has been impacting children's social emotional health, mental health during this critical period of brain development. And then we wanted to also call out that there's strong alignment with so many different state and national priorities for children's health, including behavioral health and health equity. that we're just wanting to build on that strong foundation where momentum exists and ensure that there's a focus on young children and their needs in particular.
I think Elena explained well that all children would benefit from a social emotional health touch, either kind of understanding assessments, thinking about brief interventions. That being said, in Oregon, we know of the publicly insured children, while all should receive at least some type of social emotional touch, we also know that there are children that are experiencing adverse childhood events for which the literature and evidence show that a behavioral health or social emotional touch would be incredibly valuable. So for the publicly insured children, when we look at these kinds of ACE level factors and think about the prevalence of these ACE level factors, it looks like about 26.8% of kids under 5 who are publicly insured have had 3 or more of these factors. And you, as early learning, people would probably say, gosh, any single one of those, a kid in foster care should clearly at least have a behavioral health assessment. And so while we have a need for all children to have some of these services, we also recognize that there's a group of children for which it's most important. And later on, when we show you some of the data that we're hoping to use to galvanize action, we're actually showing this data by CCO so that we can help them think through how they prioritize breadth and depth for the families that most need it. Do you want me to do this one, Elena? It's you, yeah?
Yeah, and so we did a deep level of engagement with various stakeholders, including families, but also extending to early learning and healthcare providers, as well as system leaders to really identify what are those greatest barriers and opportunities around supporting children and their social emotional health and development. And so several themes emerged, including just a need for better understanding of children's social emotional health and what kinds of services actually support social emotional health and development. And that need exists within the healthcare system as well as within families and at the community level. We absolutely heard about a limited service capacity, especially in the kind of parent-child dyadic services that are needed to have a real impact on outcomes in this age. We heard about workforce needs, including really calling out cultural and linguistic diversity that's lacking within this workforce, a limited familiarity with data, and even just knowing what services exist in the community and what is the capacity of providers out there, and some limited pathways to those community-based services. And then at the family level, families talked a lot about barriers to access, including just where services are located, transportation and childcare needs. And then going back up to the system level, really understanding and digging into some of the payment barriers that exist, whether perceived or actual, that need to be addressed. And so these barriers really drove us toward what kinds of activities and concepts we are including in the metric to ensure that we're really being strategic in driving toward addressing the barriers that are standing in the way of children and families.
So let's talk about how this metric would work. Again, a metric at a coordinated care organization that they would be responsible for in terms of thinking about the population of children that they serve publicly insured. So the vision for the metric is that children from birth to 5 and their families have equitable access to services that support their social emotional health and are the best match for their needs. So we came up with 2 components of the metric, knowing that the components enhance, expand, and get harder over time. And so in the first year, there are 2 components. One is us giving them data of the publicly insured children that they are accountable for, how many have received a social emotional health service. And then using that data to then work with their communities to understand the gap in services, the priorities for how to engage those services, and to think about those populations that have the most inequitable access and how do you assure those services. And then if you think about it, it's a building block where it just gets harder and harder. So again, keeping that data as a centering force to kind of understand, are your activities actually having an impact at a child level, but using that data to galvanize action that then targets and focus some of the barriers that were identified in the comprehensive work that's been done in the last few years. So in year 2, then actually forcing them to then think through the different components of the work in terms of community engagement, This is again where I think the early learning hubs are going to be our critical partners: workforce, access, care coordination, and payment. For those of you that know the incentive metrics that well, almost all the incentive metrics are based on the population, so a person level metric. So the goal would be to replace the system level metric with a person level metric that would hold us accountable for making sure that outcomes are changing at a child level. So let's show you the person level metric. So we are the first state to develop a metric for healthcare systems around social emotional health services for children birth to 5. And so the goal of this metric is like, how well are we reaching children and making sure that they have a breadth and depth of social emotional services? The goal of this metric is also to provide innovative ideas that there are claims and codes that could be used, but are not being used. For example, you have a really amazing workforce of home visiting nurses who have social emotional skills and could be a great workforce to partner with in terms of addressing social emotional delays. Home visiting does not currently bill for services. So part of the REACH metric is to track services, but it's also to kind of think more creatively about how do we pay for and support the services that exist in the community. So when we think about social emotional health services, there's a breadth of services that we could think about. So we decided to break it out into 2 components that roll up into one metric. So the first is assessment. So people that just assess a child's social emotional health. Again, knowing that all children should receive at least some type of an assessment if you follow Bright Futures recommendations for well child care. That's that first bucket. Then the second bucket is whether the child receives services that address a social emotional delay. And so the REACH metric gives credit for either one. Either the kid could have been assessed or services, but we're able to look at the metric by those different components. And then again, that work that would happen at the community level that would be done with the partners that you all are focused on is kind of looking at what are the assets in the community, where are there gaps in the community, and then how do we think about filling those gaps, not only to think about the breadth and of resources that are needed, but also to think about the depth of what specific resources are the best match for historically underserved children in families. And we have required that family engagement and family partnership be a component of those activities so that they're community-driven solutions that also take into account community cultural specific needs. Want to go to the next slide, Elena? So again, in that year 2, you would then take that data, take those learnings, and then focus in more on some of the policies, procedures, processes that address the barriers that we heard from the over 1,000 stakeholders that we talked to and the quality improvement efforts that we've done across the state. So let's just look at the findings. I know you guys have been working so hard on early learning. So this is the kind of humbling state, right? I personally lead quality improvement efforts focused on early childhood development. There's a number of you I've been able to work with on those efforts. And so these findings weren't surprising to us, but they also are kind of illuminating the issue that we know that exists, that despite all of our efforts in saying birth to 5 is important, what we're seeing when we look at whether children even received an assessment or a service is that we're not seeing dramatic increases for publicly insured children. So you see that line, that's going from 216 to 218. It doesn't really appear to be going up that much, right? And so as of right now, only 6.46% of children have received either an assessment or services that are within the realm of what the CCO covers. Go to the next slide. So when we think about those children, remember I showed you those children before, sometimes when you show people a rate of 6%, they go, yeah, I know it's really bad, but we're actually doing it for the most vulnerable children. So again, if we just use that proxy of vulnerability to say, well, those kids who have experienced all that social complexity, are they the ones getting the 6% of services? And the reality is that's not true. So when we look at those children who have 3 or more of those social complexity characteristics. So again, that includes foster care, that includes child abuse and neglect, that includes the parent has been in a prison for a year and been away from their child. Only 11% of those kids have had either an assessment or services. And so while they're more likely, I think knowing that only 1 out of 10 kids receive those services gives us a great opportunity to think about how we might enhance the healthcare system's role in assuring these services are provided.
And so we wanted to be sure to highlight the extensive alignment with this work with the priorities in Raise Up Oregon. So we know in Raise Up Oregon, social emotional health has been really called out and lifted up across multiple objectives, 4, 5, 7, 9 here, that several of these intersect, and the activities prioritized under each of these objectives are really aligned with this work that CCOs are going to be doing, which is an exciting moment for Oregon to be embarking on. And then we also know in the excellent progress update that was just released for Raise Up Oregon that the collaboration across sectors and agencies and our progress toward developing this measure, it's been called out as one of the key achievements. So we're really grateful that, you know, across our various efforts that we're all able to kind of recognize the opportunity in front of us and are excited to keep building alignment and keep working in close partnership with our early learning system on this work. And so just briefly, we want to highlight what's coming up for us. We were able to present our progress to the Metrics and Scoring Committee in November and heard really strong support for them, from them, signaling kind of, yes, keep moving ahead. We're excited to hear questions and input from you all today. And we're about to launch a piloting process with CCOs so that they have an opportunity to engage in piloting the draft measure specifications that we have right now. And that work will really be building off a lot of the community improvement pilots that OPIP has led. And then after we conclude the pilot in the spring, we'll be refining the measure and all of the attestation tools that are a part of the measure to present to the Metrics and Scoring Committee and the Health Plan Quality Metrics Committee for their consideration, really with the goal of proposing the metric this year such that it gets included in the 2022 incentive measure set. So it's an ambitious goal, an ambitious timeline. And as you all know, our healthcare system is not alone in having multiple really important priorities, but we feel encouraged and really hopeful about the direction. And so we'd love to open it up for questions, any broad kind of feedback that you have. And in particular, we posed a couple more specific areas. We're really eager for your input. And I'm not sure how much time we have for questions and discussion right now, but we're always open to hearing via email. And so Colleen and I can leave our emails in the chat box so that folks can reach out if you have thoughts after we conclude as well.
Okay, thank you, Elena and Colleen. We're just gonna push our agenda back a little bit, Council, and let's go ahead and take questions or respond to the questions our presenters have proposed, and just get some more clarification or information, and then we'll take our break at 3 o'clock. We've got a 15-minute break coming up. So, council members, any feedback, questions? Peter?
Yeah, Sue, and I really appreciate this work. This is a fantastic direction to go in. Very excited to see it. I just had a question on the vision that was on slide 14, which talks about from birth to age 5. And I'm wondering if there's been discussions about making that preconception to age 5, because if families have access to reproductive health care, that takes stress off families. It has an impact on the children who are born, and of course the impact on the baby in the womb. The stress in a family that is experiencing while the child's in the womb can impact the child's ability to develop social and emotional skills. So I just wondered if preconception might be part of the vision as well, preconception through age 5.
Great question, Peter.
You want me to go first, Elena? You know, this is something, Peter, we posed to the health aspects of kindergarten readiness. There were some of us pretty passionate about it if you look at ACE Literature and others. I think, you know, this metric doesn't sit alone in the measurement set. And the measurement set's kind of like a plane where you have like 12 seats and you have to decide what seats are you going to take. And So there is a prenatal postnatal metric that is proposed in the set that has actually a lot of robust screening. And so the health aspects of kindergarten readiness work group really wanted us to focus on the kind of gaps in services from birth to 5, but it's not that they didn't recognize, like we even had a prenatal section and parent section in our framework. It was when they had to pick which metrics they were going to go for, why they kind of endorsed the set, knowing that that other one existed. I will tell you, in the health complexity data that you see in us trying to kind of think about that, there was also debate. I wanted to know whether those factors had ever happened in that adult-led, because frankly, that actually, the literature would show that that's actually predictive. Thankfully, we did get agreement that those are factors that could have happened anytime in a child's life plus the prenatal period. So they're flagged up if Johnny's 8, it looks back 9 years to kind of try to take into account that and also try to illuminate that experience. So I think it's a both and, because I think some of those other efforts happen. And as we're working with CCOs, I can tell you, I'm trying to connect those two things right now. If you're doing depression screening for the mom and the mom flags with depression screening, that is a fast track to get that kid into preventive social emotional health services. So I think these things can work together. I wish there was 40 seats on the plane, but I don't get to pick. I don't get to pick the plane. It's sync. If it was me. I think Kelly. Yeah.
Yes, Kelly.
Hi. So this is, I appreciate, I had a chance to go through the presentation prior, with the materials that were handed out, and I'm very excited that this is a focus. It's a huge issue. And I think, as you stated, it's an issue for all children. There's no child for whom I think social emotional supports is not a necessary thing. My wonderings and questions are around, one, I have concern that racism is not brought up. The ACEs study left that out, and there have been subsequent studies by researchers that show the impact of racism on a child family ecosystem. Mm-hmm. And absent that, I think it's problematic because there's a huge social emotional toll. There's no question that people protesting in the streets, witnessing the violence of a Black man in the streets, that had a toll on many Black children. So I'd like to see more representation of that. I think in the same vein, on assessments, one of the issues with the kindergarten assessment was that the judgment, there wasn't any inter-rater reliability, and there wasn't ample training to ensure implicit bias was not dictating the judgment on social emotional well-being. And there have been ample studies to talk about implicit bias with young children early as 4 and 5 years old. And without training, those assessments could be problematic. So I just didn't hear, I guess part of me wondered how many Black people were involved in the creation of this, and was there a voice representing the community? And I'm sure, and there are other needs for other communities of color as well that are different, but equally important. And so I think it's really critical, if this is going to go forward, that you're hearing from Indigenous communities and what the needs are. You're hearing from the Latino community and those who understand the dynamics of undocumented, because that's a stressor, that's a social, there's so many layers with each group. And I didn't see it in the presentation represented. So that was probably my biggest overarching concern, knowing the social emotional toll. I also wonder broadly around, there was a slide that talked about essential skills missing from the current workforce. And I was happy to hear about the creativity that is being thought of with health worker. Well, you mentioned home visitors. I would say community health workers should also be on that list, and people that are connected with community. I didn't see a lot of conversation about community-based organizations and CBOs, but I think there are a lot of cultural essential skills when it comes to culturally relevant practice that lives within community-based organizations. And so the integration of them, I think, is important. And I wonder also how K-12, I understand this is, and I agree with Peter. I think the womb, mothers need the support because they do pass that on. The stress does get passed on to the unborn child. But the continuum of education, there was a point in time, I've crazily been doing this policy work long enough to remember 9-10 years ago when we were looking at
0 through 6, because it gets a child through the kindergarten experience and sort of the readiness equation. And I think that's very important. The kindergarten transition is huge. I would say kindergarten still is very much early childhood. And so ensuring, it was like it went to 0 and 6 and then it went back to 0 to 5. And I'm not saying what best practice is. I know I sat at tables with K-12 in early childhood, and we actually talked about what is best for children. And so it was based on how do we really support children to be successful in life? And that was a span of time that was important. I didn't see sort of mention with the connection with K-12 and really looking at helping children get through kindergarten, ready to learn and ready to thrive socially and emotionally. So those were the things that was a lot. I know, again, because I read it in advance, I had a lot already to think about. And then your presentation gave me even more, but those are the big high level.
Thank you so much. So many incredible comments. I'm going to respond to a few of them that are like top of mind for me. And then Colleen, please chime in too. First to your question, like, yes, we did engage Black and Latino and Asian families in the process of family listening sessions that really deeply informed the work group. And do I think we still have more work to do to continue hearing from families, and in particular, families who have been most marginalized by our system? Absolutely. And so that's 100% a priority. And I think even thinking creatively about if we're requiring CCOs to do that family engagement, like what is it that we expect and how deep of engagement and what kinds of families, are we going to clearly require be engaged? I think that's a really important consideration for us. I do hear your point around, oh gosh, I'm losing my train of thought, around racism as a critical factor to consider. And so it's something that we heard from all of the maybe not all, the vast majority of stakeholders we engaged across early learning and healthcare, is this recognition that, hey, as providers, we really need training on implicit bias, on trauma-informed approaches, on how to provide culturally responsive services. And so that, I think, is what led us to this process around requiring deep community engagement and mapping out the ecosystem of assets in a given community, including those provided by community-based organizations. What services exist out there that are supporting children and families, and which ones are doing an excellent job serving culturally diverse families, and where can we map out where those service, where that service capacity is and what the gaps are, and then make a really strategic plan that targets addressing gaps. Those were just a few responses, but I know I'm leaving out a ton. Colleen, what am I missing?
Yeah, I mean, this is one widget that has to fit in the widget, which is called the incentive metric program. And there's a lot of other levers that we're using. I think I'm really excited to hear about some of your comments because, just being in a limited time, there are some places where we're diving deeper. So for example, in terms of thinking about racism, I wanted the data to be stratified by race ethnicity, but Office of Health Equity Inclusion has pulled that data from being able to be reported by race ethnicity. So what we're doing instead is asking the CCOs to do community and level engagement and to make sure that their asset mapping of resources takes into account cultural factors. So I can share, for example, we talked about how this is building off pilot work that we've done in the community. In Central Oregon, for example, when we looked at who can serve and provide behavioral health services for children, we required that we looked at the providers by their race and ethnicity and by their language, because that is also a barrier to access of services. And it wasn't until that was done that Central Oregon realized there was nobody that spoke Spanish that provided behavioral health services, and yet that's about 22% of the population. So I think some of the work we're trying to put in the attestation component of the metric, so you just saw the child level metric part, in that attestation part of the metric, I think we can enhance and expand that, and should. And I think in terms of the family engagement, I think that's another place where we can enhance what you're talking about in a better way. Because again, having done this work in Northwest Oregon, the kinds of families and their experiences in Clatsop County and Tillamook County are really different than what I've seen and experienced of Jefferson County and Crook County, and now just starting that work in Douglas County. you know, if we gave one answer, that actually probably wouldn't be a smart answer. We have to kind of make sure that the kind of community level engagement that needs to happen is there. One of the things that was debated, and we actually went on the line of actually being more inclusive than not, is in terms of what counts as a service, is it only evidence-based services? And Caroline Cruz from the Confederated Tribes of Warm Springs did a really great job of advocating for, like, what is your evidence is often white dominant models of evidence. And so she did a really great job of forcing a really hard, important conversation. And so, as David knows, we went with the broader definition, knowing some people were like, yeah, but you don't know that those are evidence-based. And we kind of said, you know what, if this is what is actually culturally relevant and culturally connected and is actually going to engage families and create a pathway for that, then we need to go towards that. And so I really, again, you made like 20 points, and I wanted, every single one is important, and they're really relevant and important, but those would be the ones that I would highlight in terms of a strategy for the community-based providers. I'm trying to figure out the billing barriers to that, because part of this is the reach metric part has to be anchored. You know, again, we're trying to think about that slice of the pie that the CCO is not doing well enough. Like, there's a lot of things happening in the community, but in my perception, one of the things that was so interesting is the one theme that was the same across the 400 people that filled out the survey, and 380, or it was more than 400, but 380 or something from early learning. The one theme that was the same across all the people that filled out the survey: primary care providers, early learning, health system leaders, specialty providers. The one thing that was the same was, we can do early identification and we can do promotion, but when we get to the point where this child has a need, there are not services available. And so when we had to pick what seat we were putting on the plane, that's why we picked that seat. Again, if I could have picked 40 seats, we would have picked 40 seats, but we let the feedback across the state guide us in that. So now what we're trying to do is, within that seat, make sure, because what CCO incentive metrics do, when they're at 6%, what are they going to do? They're going to raise it for the most stable, dominant population, because that's the way the game goes. It's going to go from 6 to 30. So some of what we're putting into the attestation is like, you don't get credit for just raising the boat for everybody. You actually have to do targeted work for the most historically marginalized populations. And you actually have to think about not just how you're going to raise the boat for everybody, but how are you going to raise the boat for those families that we know have inequitable outcomes and also are more likely to have those factors. I think that's our way. And I think I would love actually your input on how we word that, because we're currently drafting it right now. I think that's how we're trying to do the both and in the widget that is the CCO incentive metric, which is in itself, we could have a whole conversation about that.
Okay, and I'm going to have to stop this conversation because we're going to be way far behind. Obviously, there's lots more to talk about, and we'll have to figure out how do we do some more follow-up. And Miriam, you and your staff maybe can help us figure that out, because I have a feeling this conversation could go on, and we would welcome that. So Colleen and Elena, thank you very much, not just for being with us today, but also for all the work you're doing on this. You are definitely going to be continue to impact children and families in our state. So thank you. Thank you very much.
For the time, and we would absolutely welcome more conversation. So look forward to more conversation.
Thank you. Thanks to both of you. So council, we are going to take it is 3:04. We're going to take an 11-minute break and be back at 3:15 so that we can go into our conversation with Joan and her staff around hubs, which we've been asking for a couple of months. So this is going to be an exciting next piece. So please go do jumping jacks or whatever you do to stay awake in 4-hour Zoom meetings, and we will see you at 3:15. Yeah. Oh. Oh.
Remy, can you mute everyone?
Got it.
Remy, you're not letting my video turn on.
Sorry, I accidentally, yes, that was me. It's true. Let me fix that.
Thank you. All right. Hi, Joan.
Hi, Sue. It's going to be Sarah Michelson and myself.
Yay. Thank you for being with us. Sorry that we're a little behind, but we still have plenty of time to talk with you both about hubs. Hello, and welcoming Sarah. Hi, welcome back to the council, another council meeting.
Yes, glad
And
to be here.
Harriet, welcome. I think everybody knows Harriet Dichter with the Build Initiative. And let's see, I just lost my screen of who else is on this call. Everyone we know, and Carrie McCann, whom I think all the council members remember, is another one of our build contractors. Thank you, Carrie, for being here. And we all know David Mandel. Thanks, David, for joining us also. So let's go ahead and get started. Council, you'll remember that we've talked actually for the last couple of our quarterly meetings about wanting to reconnect with the early learning hubs on kind of a statewide basis, get updated on what's going on from a statewide perspective. Each of us knows quite a bit about our own local hubs. So this is a chance to get more of a sense of what's the system look like. And obviously, Sarah, maybe, I don't know, Sarah may be leading this off, but Joan is really our lead staff in Hubdom. I think that's how it's referred to in many arenas. So we're excited to have Sarah and Joan with us. We've heard about the famous budget note for a while that the ELD needed to respond to as far as hubs and CCR&Rs and how they relate to each other and what their futures should look like. So that was sort of a catalyst for part of this conversation, and Joan's obviously going to tell us about that study. In our packets, we have information about that. We have a link to the whole study. And because of its length, I asked Remy to just actually include the recommendation part of that report so we could focus on that today with Joan. But this is what we've been asking for a while. So Sarah and Joan, thank you very much, and we'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Sue. And yeah, Joan and I will be passing back and forth. I'm really going to provide the context here, and then I'll let Joan do the majority of this, as she's the expert here. So as Sue referenced, famous budget note that we had in the 2019 legislative session, which I'm sure, like for all of you, 2019 seems like a world ago. But it compelled us to study. I'll read it a little bit to you. I know you all can read it yourselves too, but just to give you a sense of what the budget note was. Compelled us to study the feasibility of consolidating hubs and CCR&Rs to better align these regional entities into one body while maintaining the scope, purpose, and legislatively intended function of both. So this genesis of this really came from in the 2019 session that we were experiencing a lot of questions and confusion. I think we've moved beyond this. Like, why do you have two regional entities? Are they the same thing? Are they different? So go to the next slide. We wanted to use this report for a few things. One, kind of education, and two, exploring and setting up some recommendations of how we can advance the system forward. Because as you know, we we always have room to improve. So starting off, I know that this is probably old hat to all of you, but I feel like it's just good reframing, especially within the context of our beloved flower and petals and cross-system work. So what we wanted really to do is to clarify the distinct and related roles in the early learning system of each of these regional entities. And they're very different, and we've also been working over the past few years to kind of disentangle where there may have been overlap. So CCR&Rs, of course, are part of that early care and education petal. It's an imperfect comparison, but I would say at the state level, that white middle is really obviously where you all sit as the council, and that green petal is where we at the early learning division sit and focus our work. And so it's kind of the same for this regional system, but childcare resource and referral entities within regions are really about providing the workforce with the professional learning that's needed. They're charged with building the supply of childcare, and they do have a role in connecting families to childcare services. Although, as a state, several years ago, we made somewhat of a decision to centralize that within 211, but that's also a function of R&Rs. Of course, early learning hubs are there to realize coordination, collaboration, and partnership across sectors. So I just start with this to kind of frame that overall, and then if we go to the next slide to give you a little bit more context, which is that in our last biennium, our current budget that we're working with right now, hubs are funded at about 30 million for the biennium, and these and CCR&Rs are about 23. You see the primary sources of funding kind of flipped between the two. So CCR&Rs are pretty much supported by federal funding. Hubs are pretty much supported by general fund. And an exciting thing, and I somehow messed up this slide when I was editing it, so sorry. That should say less than 20% of SSA and federal funds, in general funds for CCR&Rs, but that's a huge actually increase from the biennium before, where only 5% of their overall budget was general fund. And same with hubs, we were able to realize some increases in investments for some specific work related to coordinating around SSA. So that's just the context piece to give you a sense of the size of them. This year there are now roughly equal numbers of both, 16 hub regions, and almost every hub region has a unique CCR&R at this point. So that's been a big piece too, is that regional alignment. If we go to the next slide, I'll just get into our presentation and the report and what you'll be hearing today after that context. So 2 things, as you saw in the budget note, it really compelled us to look at consolidation. I think, as you can imagine, for lots of reasons, that kind of consolidation at the front end was really not a frame that helped us gather input. And so we need to frame this report in a way that is actually helpful and gets us to the next stage of our work. So you see here, the focus of the report was really on better defining the roles of each entity, better defining the shared body of work between the entities, because that does exist, and how we can improve each entity. And you'll see in the recommendations, as Joan will go over, how we can really improve the infrastructure. So there are recommendations for ELD, and you may have seen there's a recommendation for the council. So we wanted to spend some time getting your thoughts and questions on that. We really put an emphasis on how the report was done. So we work to emphasize human-centered design, which, if you're not familiar, is a concept by using the folks who actually are going to utilize the thing you're designing. So providers, families, and other stakeholders in the community, to center those voices in how we really tackled these questions. Won't spend a lot of time on methodology, but just know that these were the groups we engaged with, and overall through various different methodologies, we got the input of over 300 unique people, many of you here in the council, and those groups above who care about and have a stake in young children. 2 things before kind of pass it off. Today's focus is really on the theory of change. That's kind of, I would put it in almost the lump of recommendations for what comes next from this report, which is really relative to the whole system, so relative to the hubs. The reason today you won't be hearing a lot about CCR&Rs is twofold. One, we want to set up the conversation for hub directors and others who will be with you all at your next meeting. And two, the report really did focus a lot more on hubs for the reason of the fact, not our methodology, not the way we looked at things, but as you all know, I think I was able to come when we could be in person at some point to talk to you about our professional learning report. So we received a $25 million biennial increase in professional learning dollars through the Student Success Act, which is already put in, I guess, gave momentum to some really big changes in the professional learning system and to the way that we resource CCR&R. So we're not going to focus really on that at all today. I'd be happy to come back and talk through that. I know that workforce issues, especially cross-sector workforce issues, really important to this table, but just to give you a preview of, you'll hear recommendations for R&Rs, but not a lot of what we will focus on today will go there. And it will really be about introducing you to this revised theory of change for hubs. And I think you'll see a lot of how that connects to you as a state body. And so with that, I'll pass it off to Joan to go through that.
Thank you, Sarah. So just quickly to make sure we're all on the same page, like, what is a theory of change and why does it matter and why was it something that we thought would be really important? So one of the things that's really important about what a theory of change does is it makes really clear the impacts we want to see for children and families, like increasing equity around children being ready for school and families having what they need to feel supported and helping to make that happen. A theory of change also defines what changes or system conditions are needed to bring about this impact, like making quality, culturally responsive supports available and accessible to all families, and that systems are aligned, coordinated, and family-centered, which should sound very familiar to all of you since that's one of our big system goals. And then finally, what is it that we're actually going to do to bring about these system changes? And I think that that's one of the areas in this theory of change that I think I can say that the hubs are the most excited about, is that they believe that this theory of change is bringing much desired clarity when it was when we were able to come together with them to kind of look over the final draft. There was just a lot of almost delight of, oh my gosh, we've been asking for this forever and now we finally have it. So it really felt as though we had both listened to them and also were able to bring their expertise into the development of the theory of change. So, what is ultimately the purpose of this theory of change? It really should be guiding both our state and local decision making and helping to make sure that we're really moving towards more equitable outcomes for young children and families. We think it's going to be really helpful for hubs to use in helping work with their governance councils and shaping what their needs assessments might focus on, what their strategic plans for their regions might focus on. And I'm definitely already getting requests from hubs about coming and really talking with their governance councils. So I'm looking forward for the opportunity to do that. So in the process of putting together this budget note, one of the things that we did is we looked at a lot of historical documents, including what I think was the maybe original theory of change. And one of the decisions that we made when we were thinking about what capacity could we build through this report. So don't just write a report, but actually use it to build capacity to help people learn and understand. We felt that it would be really important to touch in on what is the science, what is the research that the field has really been wrestling with around these kind of entities like hubs, and what can we understand about what makes them effective, and what might we do to advance a theory of change that would better enable them to guide their work and to make better investment decisions regionally, and to make sure that the choices they're making are more aligned with the actual like science or research about how they should do their work and what they should invest in. And so ultimately we're talking about, in our theory of change, impacts, our ultimate impact, of course. What are the early outcomes that we're going to start to see ahead of our ultimate impact? What are the system changes that we want to realize and that are necessary? And then what are the collaborative actions, both what are the regional strategies that need to be implemented, as well as how do the hubs need to do their work to be most effective? So I want to start by talking about impact. One of the things that you'll note, and I'm assuming some of you have already seen this as you've seen the report and looked at it, is this theory of change is very intertwined with Raise Up Oregon. And I think that's one of the things that's really powerful about it, is it really built on work that was already underway. And so our ultimate impact, of course, is children arriving ready for kindergarten. And I think just about practically everything that's been discussed in this meeting has been about all the things that are necessary, social, emotional health, the impact of trauma, like all those things that are happening that are possible impediments to children being ready to school. So really important for us, we're clear on that. What do we understand about children arriving ready for kindergarten? Well, it's gonna take a long time. Often it's a decade or more to get at something that you can measure at the population level. Like we want to see kindergarten readiness be able to be measured. As Colt was talking about early in the meeting, we may know that we don't have the right assessment, but we're still interested in understanding what's the cumulative impact of our efforts. But ahead of that kindergarten assessment, what are we looking for? What are the kind of early outcomes that we want to be seeing? Again, should be very familiar to you because it's a key aspect of Raise Up Oregon. Those early outcomes are really around families and making sure that families have access to the kind of supports and services and resources that really allow them to be their children's first teachers, that there's equitable access to really critically important things like culturally appropriate, affordable, high quality early care and education. And ensuring that families have opportunities for connection. So the kind of stories that were being told at this meeting about families aren't sure where to go yet, and people don't know where the resources might be in their community. Those are the kind of resolving those types of things are some of the early outcomes that we'd be seeing that would let us know that we're on the right track. The investments that were made in the 1921 biennium around Family Connects, this idea that for every newborn in Oregon, we want to make sure that we're connecting them to services right away. That would be an example of an opportunity for connection that we want to build. In order to realize those early outcomes, we have to work on systems changes. And what we understand right now is that if we invest in a coordinated early learning system, we're much more likely to actually realize those systems changes. And we're fortunate here in Oregon that there's been a lot of investments. And of course, we also have federal investments. But the problem is that even in Oregon, we're still really trying to deal with an inherently fragmented approach. We have federal policy coming from multiple federal agencies, funding coming from multiple federal agencies. We have multiple state agencies with multiple funding streams. And so that fragmentation and how we deal with that is like the crucible of success. And both the state level work and the regional work that is conducted by hubs and with their partners as governance, that's where we really have the opportunity, I think, for much improvement in terms of realizing this multi-sector early childhood system. How can we have stronger systems change strategies that lead to the kind of alignment that Peter was talking about, the iterative, ongoing work that they are doing in their community to align across their sectors so that curriculum in early learning aligns with what children need to know and be successful in kindergarten, and that they're making deliberate choices about those things and working together to do them. How can we coordinate how things are happening so families don't have to run from place to place to place to get the services they need? They can go to centralized places and get support and resources without having to knock on 10 different doors. And fundamentally, how are we centering families in our system so that we're from the get-go, from the design point, we're designing services with them in mind? That we're not trying to bring in the family voice and the family centeredness on the back end of things, but we're bringing it in on the front end of things. To realize those system changes at the regional level and the state level is the twofold. So for us as a system, ELD and other state agencies, as is defined in Raise Up Oregon, need to work together with our regional entity like hubs and our regional partners on those systems change strategies. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what's important about those. And then how the hubs do their work also really matters. And that is an area where I feel that based on the information that we learned from this study, and certainly what we've heard from hubs, is they are excited to understand the ways in which their work could improve, and they're eager to get going on doing that work. So what do we know about effective systems change strategies? They need to address root causes. So often in communities, what happens is that we focus on symptoms and resolving symptoms, and there's nothing wrong with that. It just tends to perpetuate the problem. And what we need is collaborative partnerships like hubs who bring people together across sectors, different voices, families, and others to really say, what are the root causes here? So that they aren't just defined by the Hub Governance Council, but they're defined by engagement with local stakeholders. Effective systems change strategies are cross-sector. They're not just carried out by one entity in isolation from others. They use integrated approaches. So they're bringing together a bundled strategy. So for example, they don't just focus on professional learning, which is really important, but they also look at policy. They look at practices, they look at who's making decisions, and they bring those things together. And I think one of the places where I feel we can really make a lot of progress is on effective implementation. So how are we ensuring that the strategies we're putting into place are having the intended effect on the benefit, on the intended beneficiary? So are we talking to families about, is this really making a difference in your lives in the way we intended? And then critically important here is the people who need to implement these strategies need to know how to do that effectively. And I think we also have opportunity for improvement in that area. So one of the things that research tells us is that there are some really important elements of work that entities like early learning hubs can be improving on in almost every case, because collaborative partnership work is hard. Like most collaborative partnerships in the country, even the ones that have been around a long time, like for example, the North Carolina Partnerships for Children, all struggle with the same things. It isn't like we're in a unique universe where no one else is struggling. It's very hard to do this kind of cross-sector work, but we do know some things that really make a difference in that. And some of those things are here. The kind of 5 big buckets of things is, you know, we have to have hubs really have a strong shared vision where they have shared goals with many stakeholders. There has to be an explicit focus on equity. They need to be building local champions. They've got to have strong cross-sector engagement where families are really financially supported and enabled to be a part of decision-making along with others who are impacted. We need a stronger focus on systems level problem solving and action. Hubs are known and renowned for being amazing conveners. I would like to hear them described to us in a few years as amazing action takers. And, you know, that we've switched that language from convening to actually what are the actions, the shared actions that are taken. And that is one of the ways that we really have hubs known. And I don't think it's because they're not taking shared action. I think it's because we need to help, all of us need to work together to help each other talk more, like Peter was sharing today, of the systems change strategies and the actions that they're taking, less focusing on whether or not they're convening people, more focus on action and ongoing learning. We have these opportunities are really places for us to increase effectiveness. I'm just going to briefly take us through the recommendations. But one of the things that we really want to focus on is how do we support hubs through the scope of work that they have with the early learning division to increase their effectiveness in these areas, and also to increase their effectiveness in really putting forth systems change strategies like the ones I described that have those kind of attributes. So the recommendations that we had in the report for the hubs, what we're working on right now is, moving forward with adopting this theory of change, refining the hub scope of work, and we're really working hard to figure out if there's any way that we can refine the hub funding approach within the funding that we already have to enable hubs to have more internal capacity to carry out that work that I was talking about. Because right now, many of them are challenged by the level of funding that they have to be able to do the kind of work in the manner in which they'll be most effective. For the CCR&Rs, we've already refined their scope of work based on this report, and we're really focusing on how to make sure the resources from the Student Success Act Professional Learning Plan are able to increase the impact of CCR&Rs and their ability to serve, and make sure that there's resources for providers who are not English speaking, and focusing on things like inclusion, better inclusion supports, which we also heard when we were conducting this report. In terms of the hubs and the CCR&Rs, one of the things that we are putting into both the scopes of work is a shared opportunity for them to really work together in their regions around building regional childcare supply. And we know from the report that there's a lot of efforts underway. Some are fledgling and some are very well developed, like what Katie Brooks has talked about is happening in her area is something that we would like to both support hubs and CCR&Rs to work on, but also to build from there. How can we have hubs really playing the kind of role that Sarah was describing, fulfilling that cross-sector role, and how can CCR&Rs really be positioned to help also build supply? For the early learning division, there were a number of recommendations. I would say key is around how we can really support what I'm talking about in this theory of change, and what we'd like to see for the hubs and the CCR&Rs in terms of what can we do to refine how we're administering, managing, and providing technical assistance to these entities, so we're supporting their collective success in the region, so that we get the kind of synergy from these two regional entities that we heard from people across the state is critically important to them. Related to this council and the legislature, I will say that every hub report that has ever been written says that hubs have issues with access to reliable and usable data. And so when we did this report, I was like waiting with my ear out, am I going to hear about that again? And I can tell you that almost every stakeholder we talked to talked about the challenges that are out there related to data. And I think the expectations for the hubs for the beginning was that they were going to make data-driven decisions. They were going to be able to have metrics. We were going to be able to show their impact. Until we deal with this data issue in a much more serious way, it is going to be nearly impossible for them to realize that. And it isn't, the early learning division can't solve this problem alone. The council can't solve it alone. It really is going to take a long-term effort. But if we're serious about wanting to really be able to understand, are we achieving those early outcomes? Are we getting to the populations we want to? Are the strategies having the intended impact? You have to have data to do that. And then finally, we had a number of issues, I'm sure no surprise to any of you, that came up in putting together the report that were cross-agency issues that were identified. And it seems as though there is opportunity for some additional cross-sector work. And something that came up, for example, that would be very helpful to hubs is, could we have some shared messaging that would go to each of the agents, from the agency directors to regional counterparts, that really was a clear message about why they're on hub, sitting on a hub governance council, what the expectations are for their membership, and how they can really contribute to the success of the hub. Because right now we have 16 different hubs trying to make 16 different cases to 16 different DHS people and public health people and maybe business people. So anything that the council could think about doing to help really support, so that hubs can not have to spend their time convincing people they should be a part of the work, but actually focus on taking action related to their strategic plans and to improving outcomes for children and families in their region. So, and I think that's all we prepared, but we're happy to take questions and appreciate the opportunity to share this work with you.
Yeah, absolutely. Sue, are you okay if we take the two in the chat to start off with? Okay, great. Maybe I will try to tackle your question, Kali, and have Joan and Miriam add in, and then I think it'd be great, Joan, to look at Katie's question. So Kali asked about whether hubs are currently held accountable for measurable action, so we can look at moving efforts towards greater action orientation and less convening orientation. I think in some way, so I'll say a few things and try to limit the things I said. This has been, you know, I think in the several years, and we're created at the same time as hubs and the council and the ELD there, this is maybe our, and the ELC, our first opportunity that we've really taken for almost like a wholesale reset's probably too dramatic of a word, but through this process, we heard a lot about our reporting mechanisms. We have been looking at our monitoring for the last few years, and we're like, okay, we're going to do this report and then we're going to align it. So I think, to be completely honest, we're at a problem identification phase. Like, we don't have the right data that we need. Our reports and maybe the way we've measured things have unintentionally maybe conflated all the things, like the convening, you know, that if partnership is partnership sort of as a measure, is a very simplistic way to say it. And so I think are both open to feedback here from you all, and also we'll be using what the spot we're at now and the scope of work as we're revising it to develop different measures. I think, if you probably remember, we started the hubs with like these very specific accountability measures, and I feel like we've almost went the you know, in a reaction kind of the opposite way, and we need to find the right middle ground regarding monitoring data and accountability, because ultimately, just like us, they exist to serve families and children in their community, and so we should, you know, both be held accountable that way. So I'd pause to see, Kali, if you had anything else you want to add, or anything you wanted to say. That answer was fine, that's great, but anything else that comes up for you?
And if I could just briefly add, I would say we've focused a lot on outputs and that the current reporting. And when I say taking action, I'm like actions that promote systems change. And we need, you know, to Sarah's point, that's the kind of thing I think we need to get better at measuring and holding people accountable for. Those are the kind of investments that we want to be supporting. How does this promote alignment? How does this promote coordination? How does it promote family-centeredness? Like, we should be able to draw a line from any hub investment to that kind of systems change.
The only thing I would add, and I don't think I'm going to tell you that much that you don't already know, Kali and others, is that the constant has been that the accountability measures and the theory of change has changed across these 8 years. Sort of, so it's not that it hasn't iterated, it's just that it's been constantly changing. So I think that's just the reality of how we answer that question, and in a part why I think this is so transformative. Not to say we're just the latest in a string of changes, but I think we tried to harness all that has been learned across the 8 years of doing this into a new theory of change. with an accountability framework, with an aligned technical assistance strategy. I mean, that's the other thing. There has not been consistent technical assistance to hubs, right? And that's pieces that, you know, ELD has to own across all of these years. So I think there's a lot there that makes this moment, I think, exciting to build on what we learned in sort of a reset on a number of these things that have been challenges all along.
So Miriam and Joan, how will the metrics or outcomes versus outputs, Joan, be determined, be set? You know, we used to have measuring success, and I see David's on the call, committee that did a lot of work on measurements, but what's going to be our approach for getting those set? So the hubs know what is the target that we're asking them to shoot for.
Well, I think as a part of their strategic planning, they need to set performance measures and progress measures. So I've been thinking a lot about the fact that because we have no one here, this isn't new to anyone, but hubs have very different conditions on the ground. People's strategic plans are going to be different. They may be implementing the same kinds of strategies, but in terms of like where they're starting from. And so one of the things that we perhaps haven't had enough focus on is regional support to set your performance measures. Like, what are you trying to achieve through the strategies that you're implementing? So what are the systems changes that you're going to be realizing? And then progress measures, so not just your outputs, but what's going to be different as a result of the activities or the actions that you're taking. So I don't necessarily believe in that we only want to set these metrics at the state level. I think we need to make these collaborative partnerships accountable for what they are prepared to achieve. And we need to certainly have, as Miriam said, support and provide TA for that. But we have the system level goals already, you know, in Raise Up Oregon, and we have those early outcomes. And I think we need to support what some of those things are going to look like, but we need more focus on people actually having to take responsibility for what they're trying to achieve in their region.
Yeah, I as with everything, maybe there's always that balance between having the state at least set what are the common statewide goals that we want all 16 hubs to be focused on versus what are the regional priorities that align with those. Okay, other questions from council members or comments on the theory of change, you know, what you're seeing your hubs doing in your own regions, how we as a council can support the hubs in their work and support staff in sort of this reset, I guess.
And Sue, it looks like we have a question from Katie and Ann too in the chat.
Oh, okay. Sorry, I wasn't following the chat.
Okay.
So I know Katie had asked, and I feel like Joan, you probably have a good answer from this. How would, with the new collaboration between these entities, what would this look like on the ground for provider or family?
The hub and the CCR&R working together. Is that what you were asking, Katie? On supply building? Or
yeah, what different experience, what value add will they see?
From their hub and CCR&R working together.
Okay, so let's say I'm a provider.
Yes.
An example. Go ahead.
Katie, you have frozen temporarily.
Sorry.
On my screen.
Shall I answer?
Sorry.
Oh, you back?
I'll just go ahead and answer. Yeah.
Yeah, so maybe I can answer Anne's question. So Anne, we have aligned, we have now 15 CCR&Rs, and so we are pretty much aligned with regions. And then in regions where we didn't establish a new CCR&R, we, like for example, in Merriam, Polk, and Yamhill, we established a satellite office in Yamhill. And then we established an additional satellite office for the CCR&R in Multnomah County as well. So trying to make sure that in areas where we didn't necessarily think we could, like in Multnomah, we didn't want to have another CCR&R, but we needed more coverage because there's more providers. But then in kind of the same in Yamhill, but we have now the Eastern Oregon CCR&R. We split the Eastern Oregon region up, and now there are 3 CCR&Rs over there where there used to be 1. So I think it's a much better alignment among the regions.
Okay, do you want to go back to Katie's question? I think looking for sort of a concrete example. And my impression from Katie is not that it's so much focused on CCR&R hub, but just with this hub reset that the theory of change is proposing. How will people on the ground see that change?
Well, I think in some hub regions, families will hopefully become engaged in helping to shape decision-making, both like defining what are the problems the hub should be focusing on, what are the strategies the hub might be using to address those, how should we spend our resources, because we don't have all hubs engaging families in that. So I think that's something very concrete that I would like to see happen. One of the other pieces of feedback that we heard is that CCR&Rs often are the provider voice at a hub governance council. And so one of the things that we would like to see happen is that the hubs would at least hold some of their meetings at times when it would be possible for stakeholders that are not directors of agencies or high-level leaders to be able to attend those meetings and actually be able to offer their perspectives. Like childcare providers, they can't come to a daytime meeting because they're running their childcare business. So could there be some possibility with hubs offering and holding their meetings? So changing the logistics might be another example of better engaging stakeholders. So, I mean, ideally, one of the things that we would like to see happen is that all hubs would have a parent council that's associated with them. And that is something that is would like to see in the hub scope of work going forward. And so that they have an ongoing body that's associated with their governance council that's bringing together families, and that they have an ongoing process by which they're engaging families in their work, and that those families are engaging with other families in the community. So we're starting to build a much stronger network of families and communities.
Okay, and we are just about out of time, but any other, did I miss anything else in the chat, Sarah?
Nope, I think we got everything in the chat.
Okay, thanks. Any other questions from council members, comments, staff, any other input?
Sue, I would just add to as the collaboration grows, one of the things that we've been able to do is to have professional development opportunities for providers, the same PD opportunities that K-12 educators are having. So to help to try to develop a common language, and then that same professional development, take it out to the community as well. So we don't call it professional development in the community. We just call it, you know, here's a workshop on this, or here's a screening of this documentary. And so just try to create that common language between the providers, the different systems, and the community as a whole.
Yeah, and Peter, while you're talking, do you want to mention that book that you put in the chat box?
Sure, that's weird. It's a book that came out a couple of years ago called The Good News About Bad Behavior. And I really can't recommend it enough. It's a really great researcher who went into what the changes are in terms of what our kids are facing. This is pre-COVID, in terms of their ability to develop self-regulation skills. and how it's been diminished over time because our kids are living in a different world now, and that we have to intentionally now work on building self-regulation skills, because unless you have self-regulation skills, you can't get to resilience, that it's foundational. So I can't recommend enough The Good News About Bad Behavior. If you want to just check it online, it's a great book.
Okay, thank you. That's a great title. Okay, Joan and Sarah, thank you very, very much, especially you, Joan, who obviously are taking the lead in this whole theory of change and looking at the future of hubs in our state. And I think you can tell from the council members that we're all very supportive and very interested in helping in any way we can. I've heard from a couple of hubs that what you said at the beginning, Joan, about their governance boards would really like to have an overview of the theory of change. And I'm guessing other council members would be glad to partner with you in doing that.
Okay, great.
So,
thank you. Thanks again
thank
for
you.
the opportunity.
Yep, you're sweet. Thanks. And thank you, Sarah. Okay, council, last and not least is our legislative agenda. So this is the last page of our packets, as I'm sure you know. And the only contact, I've asked Harriet and Carrie from Build to help facilitate this conversation. And the only context I want to put around it is that you all know the legislative process well enough to know that when you look at our 21 legislative priorities that are in the packet, and they're cross-sector, not every one of those is going to manifest itself in a bill, a legislative bill. So there's not going to be like a one-to-one correlation. Look at House Bill X and you'll see number one taken care of. So we just have to know that there are already some House and Senate bills that have been dropped that are specific to our priorities. So we can certainly talk about those. But some of these are just going to have to be priorities that we champion, regardless of whether there's a bill in the session that addresses it. So it's sort of a legislative focus, but it's also a bigger focus than that because it's longer standing than just 6 months of the legislature. So with that, I will turn it over to Harriet. Thank you, Harriet.
Thank you, Sue. Good afternoon, everyone. So I guess the good news about the last item on the agenda is it's really going to be a great opportunity for everyone to brainstorm and share together, because I know from the agenda we've spent a lot of time listening and asking questions today, and this is really around thinking for everyone who's on the council about opportunities for you as council members and for the council itself in that really important role you have as champions and educators, basically to be thinking about how you want to be sharing your early childhood priorities as put together in this legislative priorities, and whether there are areas of special emphasis, because as Sue said, the good news about Raise Up Oregon is it's really comprehensive, and the bad news about Raise Up Oregon is it's really comprehensive, right? So it gives you a lot basically to be champions for. So, and finally, just to remind people, if we took all of Raise Up Oregon and treated it as a legislative priority, that would be giant, right? So this year was the first opportunity that all of you had to come together and say we are thoroughly committed to systemic change, right? And to things that are equitable advancements for children and families in the state. And we want to start to put some parameters around what really we think are things that we want to engage with in that champion role with the legislators. So it's year one of the process, and this is actually our first conversation like this. So as we were planning it, this is our thinking about how to proceed. There are two questions that we thought would be helpful for everyone to explore together, not necessarily to reach a final conclusion, but to really hear from everyone who is on council in terms of your thinking about these questions. And the first of these questions is to really think about what are the ways that the council either as a whole or members individually, can share the Early Learning Council legislative priorities, both with stakeholders and with decision makers. Okay, so stakeholders who may influence what legislators may choose to do, and legislators themselves. The second thing that we wanted to put forward for discussion, and Carrie is putting these into the chat box for people who are getting tired, okay, and another way to process this is within the legislative priorities, which Sue has emphasized, they are cross-sector. They do not represent 100% of the plan, but they represent key elements, but they still go on for a bit, okay, in our initial foray into this. Are there any areas of particular emphasis, all right, that people really want to think are important for the council to pursue this year? So these are the two questions, all right, that we had. And this is our thinking about what we'd like to do. We actually would like everyone to pause for a minute and just jot down for yourself initially what your ideas would be, either about what you might do as a council member, what you think the council as a whole might do, or what someone else might do, you not as a council member, but some other council member might do, in terms of sharing the priorities with stakeholders and decision makers. And then the second that we'd like you to also jot down your thinking is looking at that list. And if anyone needs it, we can put it up on the screen, I think, right, Remy? If we have to, we can show it to people. So you'll tell us in the chat or if you want us to do that. Are there any things that you especially want to emphasize? Okay, Anne is saying yes. So let me, before we put it up though, Remy, is the other thing when you're jotting down is you might have a different question. These are the questions we planned. We think they're good questions, but we've worked, Carrie and I worked with you all for a long time now. So you might also have another question and an answer to your question that you want to share. So jot that down too. And what we, again, would like to do is we'd like to make sure everyone has an opportunity to participate. So to kind of treat then your first foray as kind of a round robin, where everyone will go, you'll decide when you want, we can call on you if you want us to, but you all are really experienced at just, chatting and putting that out there. And we hope that we have enough time that everyone would get through a round, and that would then give us enough time to react to each other's ideas and sort of set the stage basically for next steps that you would be able to take. So are we good with what we're saying as a plan forward? Because I don't want Remy to put up the piece for Anne until I make sure that everybody's comfortable. Okay, so it sounds like we're good. So Remy, if you can put up the screen and let's leave it up there for maybe a couple minutes, Remy, and then you'll take it down and then we'll start our round robin. And Anne, because we know especially whoever, just put in the chat if you need Remy to scroll, okay, at some point.
Okay, it's Anne. I remember them now. You can take them off. I know what we're talking about.
Okay, good. And they're in the significant packet, Anne, that we also sent to you.
Yep. I know where we are. So thank you. You can take it off the screen now. Thanks.
Okay. All right, so let's give everybody a few minutes to jot down your thoughts so that we can share. And we'll get a sense of whether people have the same ideas and a consensus, or people have different ideas and come from different points of view about what you think makes sense in terms of the council and your championship role. maybe Sue, we can get started when our two members return to their desks. I can't see them right now.
Yeah, they just may be off.
I know. I know.
Yeah, I know.
I understand the part about needing a break. So
I'm here.
Got it,
I
Holly.
just had my video off.
Right.
Yeah, and I had my.
I see.
I could hear you. I was just
Yeah.
waiting.
But let's
Okay.
wait for Anne to come back so everybody can hear. And then whoever wants to go first can think about sharing first. Okay,
Okay.
Anne is back. Who wants to start, get us kicked off?
I tend to always jump into these gaps, but somebody else can jump in if they want
It's
to.
good, Peter. You'll be a great beginning and you'll still have plenty of opportunity to share later too.
Okay, so you just want me to cover the first question first here?
For both, actually the first and the second, we kind of realized we'd probably run out of time if we separated them. So go forth on both of them.
So for at least for personal advocacy, I've been out of the legislature for 4 years, but I still do have contacts in the legislature. And I'm happy to personally contact my personal contacts and try to convince them of moving on the priorities. I'm also very willing to testify, particularly if we testify via Zoom. I'm more than happy to arrange time to do that. On the priorities, I really look at like number 5 and 15. I have a sense of urgency. We talked about a lot today. Expanding access to mental health consultation, early care and education, and then establish a behavioral mental health workforce for families with young children. That's such a crying need. I really think we need to push that as hard as possible. And then I would go with on number 8. I don't think we can get it done this session, but I think we have to start planting the seeds that we have to have a new model for funding, because we're never going to be address the workforce issue unless we have a new model for funding and we can actually pay people a living wage, even better than a living wage, in order to do the work. So that's how I look at it.
Thank you, Peter, for kicking us off. We really appreciate that. Who wants to share next? Anne?
So first of all, I want to say, I think this whole meeting has been great. I loved all of the presentations that were made, and I think they were exactly what we needed for where we are. I think in terms of priorities, I think we just cannot ignore the fact that COVID has changed everything. And our wildfires in our rural communities have changed everything. And if we don't talk about that as a short-term context, we're missing something. And I appreciate that the role of this council is long-term systems change and systems building. But this COVID stuff is going to stick with us for a long time, and it's affected our most vulnerable families. And so somehow we have to figure out how to bring this into where we are. Especially, I think, around childcare. The childcare has never been more front and center, and I can't imagine that childcare can't be a priority for us. And if this isn't a moment for us to talk about what Peter just said, which is, and what we've all been saying, and what Katie says all the time, that our model for our financial model for childcare is broken. We have a chance at this moment. This crisis moment is a moment when maybe we get to shake things up a bit. And I kind of want to encourage us not to lose the sense of urgency that comes from this crisis. And then the other thing I want to say is I loved the whole presentation about the social emotional learning and so on, because I do believe that the whole field is moving in this direction and that the whole policy context is moving in this direction. And so again, I believe that there's a momentum there that we need to grab onto, because there's language now, there's scholarship around it, there's policy consistency around it, and so on. And so I kind of don't want to lose where we know we have momentum now because of COVID, its effect on social emotional learning, its effect on childcare. And so I'll conclude by saying, I love that our role is systems building and systems change. But I also believe that we should not forget that we have a crisis moment now that allows us to ask really important, deep questions and fix some really important questions, some really important broken systems.
Great comments.
Thank you, Anne.
I can go next, Sue. This is Angie.
Yep.
So individually for sharing the priorities, I can share at the government to government quarterly meetings with all the Oregon tribes. And then I can also use other forums that all Oregon tribes are engaged in especially in education and family services. And I can identify what those are. I've only thought about government to government specifically, but I know there are other forums as well. And then for my priorities, or where I think the council's priority should be, I fully agree with number 8, which was adopting the new models for funding that Peter and Anne both talked about. Number 6, developing a diverse workforce is crucial because we can't grow what doesn't exist yet. We don't have a workforce, a big enough workforce. And then again, back to behavioral mental health, number 15, these are really crucial for the times. I think that's very relevant to what Anne was just saying, also just about the crisis that we're overcoming with COVID and the fires. It relates back to what Kali was talking about earlier, as far as trauma and racism. And so I think that behavioral health workforce is also very essential. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Angie.
I can go next. In terms of what I can do, I will say I'm happy to testify and talk to any legislator in my region. I know most of the ones that are in my region, and a few that aren't. But I have testified and talked about a few different other things, so I kind of feel like they're tired of hearing from me. So I would say that caveat. But just, let me know. I've tried to align some of, I was one of the leads on the education policy coming out of Reimagine Oregon, and I tried to align some of it with what I knew the Early Learning Council was focused on. So there's overlap in some of those areas. So some of those things are already, I've talked about just because of that alignment, but it's certainly not fully, it doesn't cover all the areas at all. So I would say that in terms of the things that are most important, and I want to just echo Anne, I think this has been a really helpful meeting, and I just appreciate all that has been shared. I feel like we're about to step off a cliff when it comes to social emotional well-being of children. I'm very, very concerned, and I want to like scream from mountaintops for people to pay attention, because it feels like everyone's talking about it in these virtual spaces, but I don't see a lot of presence around it, and I don't think families know how to get the support. So one of the most important things that I had was number 5, which is expanding the access to consultation, and I think in partnership with people on the ground connected with families so that they have access to what they need. I think that's huge. I think that we are going to see an increase in behavioral issues because the neuroscience says they're connected. So the social emotional dysregulation is going to result in more behavior issues. And so ensuring there's the consultation, but also I thought that the shared professional practice, but specifically around social emotional supports was important. It doesn't say that there, or restorative practice is a term I use a lot, but I think the entire early childhood and K-12 system needs to figure out, and I think it's helpful to do it together. Oftentimes they share families, like, kids are not monoliths, and, a 2-year-old has a 6-year-old sibling, and, et cetera, et cetera. So having everybody speak the same language and have some training that helps support children and families is key. And then, like everybody else has said, I think that the workforce thing is huge. And we have to make our early childhood workforce sustainable. It's been hit hard. I honestly think it's criminal how low we pay our early child ECE workers. And I think if the pandemic has taught us nothing, it's how important they are to our economy and our ecosystem. So let's do the right thing. So those are my sort of 3 priority areas.
Okay, thanks, Kali.
I can go next. This is Peg. I agree with what everyone has said, and I also have found this to be a really helpful meeting. I think as far as, ability to share things, I'm not very well connected to politicians, to legislators. I certainly am involved with the Oregon Pediatric Society and other medical groups, as well as the Oregon Association for Child Abuse Centers, and would be happy to share that message. I think we're, both of those groups are acutely aware of the effects of COVID and trauma that's been associated with that, as well as with wildfires. And that the effect on kids. And, none of this is new, but I agree. I think there is a momentum out there. And oftentimes in association with the momentum is some money, which helps to get some things done. As far as priorities, I think what everyone else has shared, when you look through this list, it's hard to really pick out things that are less important because they're all really important. But I think fixing our childcare system, I don't think we can overlook housing, because people can't focus on social emotional well-being and so forth if they're not secure in their food or their housing. Those are just basic essentials that we have to be sure that we have met for people. But certainly the social emotional supports, and making sure that those are available in our rural areas, because oftentimes it's very hard if you work in a rural area to find a referral or someone that is adequately trained to address those needs in kids. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Peg.
I'll go next if you want. I can try and turn my screen on again.
Okay, thanks, Katie.
Sorry.
We understand teenagers, so don't worry.
Yeah, I have one additional one temporarily living with me, so it's interesting. So there's several, I think my overall umbrella of what I bring, I do a lot of advocacy. I spend right now probably 60% of my time on the legislature until session is done on any number of issues. So I think my secret weapon is Representative Zika. I've got a really strong relationship with him. He's vice chair of the House Early Childhood Committee. And I just had a great interaction with them today about the economics of why it doesn't work, and what streamlining looks like, and what efforts from the private sector I've seen. So a couple of things. So I think number one, the direct contracting, things that will streamline and elicit cost efficiencies that make this thing financially work. The second one is reducing silos. Anything that goes toward efficiency is something that I'm very interested in helping with. Increasing supply, obviously number 7. And then number 12 was identifying resources for early care, in as much as are there others out there that we're not tapping into that can help pull this thing off, which is at the end of the day, increasing substantially the amount of quality child care positions and making them affordable to a broad spectrum of folks, from the underserved all the way to whomever wants to go back to work and wants their child to be in a great place during the day. So that's what I can bring to the table. I'm happy to testify again. And I have weekly almost conversations with Representative Zika. So whatever I can do to be of use. And we also have our very first Democrat in the House for a very long time. Jason Kropf took Sherry Helt's seat. And I think he'd give me some time on this as well as Senator Knopp.
And let me just make a quick comment, Katie, because when we talked last week, you mentioned the lack of childcare facilities, that's just a huge issue. And number 12 on our list is really broad. It's all resources for ECE, but also with a focus on facilities, which I've heard from other council members as well.
Yeah. Great.
I think Sue might want to go last.
Yeah.
George, do you want to share?
Yeah, I think I just heard my name to share.
You did.
I've been in and out today, so I'm sorry. I am getting Zoom fatigued myself.
We understand, George. Thanks for coming back for the end of this.
You guys are awesome. I think what I wrote down is for my number one was expand access to mental health consultation and early care and education. In the end, it's back to recovery or back to well-being or back to being regulated or back to relationships or back to building responsibility. Like all these things right here create a kid that's ready to learn, or a person that's ready to move forward with their life, a person that's ready to have good, I'll just say collaboration and problem solving skills. Everything for us in our school district does have a lot of, I'll just say indicators around building relationships, having students regulated, and then having good routines. Because we believe that those are the kind of things that help a person to be successful. So anything around that, social, emotional, trauma-informed, recovery, coming back to a pre-COVID state of well-being is important. My next one was also the mental health workforce for families and young children, so that we can help families to be the best first parents for their child, the first teachers for their child. We want them to be strong in the household, to have great skills, to have good relationships with their children, to have those great routines, to be able to process and reflect and go over things, at the house, and be able to have a regulated parent and a regulated child at home is a big deal. I put my next one as increase the supply of quality, affordable, culturally responsive childcare. So the more we can increase quality, affordable, culturally responsive childcare. Adopt new models of funding for early care and education based on cost of service, including living wage for providers. So I do agree that we need to do better. We need to make it a much more. I sometimes mess around with Sue and I tell her I don't really want to compete too deeply with K through 12 and lose good K through 12 teachers, but I understand. And if we do, then that's part of the deal. And so if we do have really strong 0 to 5-year-old educators and we lose some of the K through 12 workforce, I think it's time for us to be okay with that in K through 12 and be supportive of that. So I really think that making it a better service and a better wage for providers or for employees is good. I think we need to also reduce silos so that we can have good information back and forth and create good transitions and support for children, whether early learning hubs or whether preschools or whether childcare coming up to K through 3, K through 2, we need to have good services to transition children and families into the early learning part of K through 12. I did put down expand the ability to use housing dollars and to contract with community-based organizations. I think for me, schools are definitely community-based organizations, and they do provide some of their space, some of their facilities to be able to house expansion for early learning and early learning care. And there needs to be some funds for those facilities or to retrofit or remodel or create spaces. We can say a lot of things and we can hire a lot of people and we can try to fill places up, but if you don't have a place for them, that's a problem. So that's something that we need to have in terms of facilities. And then I put in there expand early intervention, early childhood special education. I'm not as certain about who's not getting served, but I do feel like having enough funds to do a good job serving students and being proactive in that or better preventative is important.
All right. Thank you, George. And thanks for your willingness for us to pay early childhood educators well enough so they'll compete for the kindergarten teachers. When I was running the relief nursery in Salem, we always lost our preschool teachers to kindergarten as soon as openings came up. So it'd be nice to have it go the other way for a change. Well, I certainly agree with everything you all have said. For me, and it's not and that I don't agree we need to seize the moment since it's been given to us. But looking at a longer term vision, I think the number 3, which is the independent early learning agency, I think it's something that we need to prioritize and come alongside. I know both the governor is strongly in favor of that, and also Rep. Power is, and some other really key legislative leaders. So my sense is that this is sort of the time to also seize this moment where we have leadership in the political part of the state to support that. And certainly connected to that, but also separate from it, is number 4, which is the whole ERDC piece. And moving that over to ELD, where the Office of Child Care is, so we can actually have a coordinated, aligned childcare system, which would be unique for Oregon. And a great step forward. And I guess connected to all of that is number 9, which is to hold on to the COVID-related changes in the ERDC. You know, it's a shorter term fix, I think, that can help a whole lot of families who are struggling to access childcare. So I would just add those to the list, but certainly agree with what you all have said about the behavioral health and social emotional. That's huge and only going to get bigger as schools reopen. So Harriet, I think we're back to you or Carrie, however you're
We
doing.
are with one question. Sue, do you want to share any other ideas you have with the group about roles for council as a whole or for individuals? We've heard a lot of things from council members that range from really generous opportunities who share relationships they have and willingness to be outspoken or to make connections to other organizations and people that are very issue specific that actually go beyond the very issue that they're working on. So I just wondered, so if there's anything there in addition you wanted to call out at your own thinking about potential opportunities for council leadership from a communications perspective, again, and Miriam has added in here, I think rightly, where we have some history, the potential also as things continue to move forward with the federal relief packages, okay, some additional opportunity to communicate.
Yeah, thank you. A couple of comments, and Miriam, I really appreciate you getting us focused on the federal potential, because it's obviously huge and dwarfs what the state could possibly do. So we should figure out who's got some connections with some of our congressional delegation and then really take advantage of those. Several of you have mentioned that, you know, you have networks of your own. PEG's got many in the healthcare community. Angie obviously is connected to the tribal leaders and nations in our communities and state. Katie in the business community and probably a statewide chamber network. So I think, you know, Peter's in lots of education networks and Ann in philanthropy. So I think to the extent each of us looks at those networks we have and professional connections we have to infuse these conversations and raise our priorities will be really helpful. And then one other thought I had, I was talking to Dana Hepper earlier today, and I think many of you know her. She's at the Children's Institute coordinating their the Early Childhood Coalition advocacy. And I think it would be informative if we invited Dana to come to our next council meeting in February and share with us the coalition's early childhood agenda. Needless to say, it aligns in many respects with our agenda, but it might make for a good discussion to invite her. And Kali, I know she had to step off, but she was on, or is on, I guess, you know, the Racial Justice Council has an education recovery, is that the name, Miriam? Recovery Committee? Yeah. So whether we want to also try to connect with them and invite some comments from them. And Miriam, I know you track that or on that, so you may have a better sense of that. But just another thought of how do we make connections with others who are advocating for similar investments in our state.
Thank you, Sue. Okay, so I think before, Carrie actually has been taking notes. So she has volunteered. She actually volunteered before we end to give us a whole summary of everything everyone said. That's our direction forward. But before we get to that, we actually have a few minutes. So I think it would be great to hear from others. Sue did get to go last. So she got to share her summary view and adding a few things from the chair's perspective. But let's hear reaction to other things people said, either about the priorities, you know, or about the different engagement methods, basically, whether federal or state, basically. And I see, Miriam, you can see that Anne, you know, I think Miriam definitely can explain how to make the connections, because there's a lot of money riding in the new proposal for childcare. That's ongoing, continuing money, not just one time only. So that's a really rich opportunity. Do you want to start there, Miriam, say anything more about that? And then we can open back up to the group.
Yeah, I can give some, I guess, high level thoughts. One, you know, I think as folks are hearing here, I touched on earlier, there's about 100 million that we are expecting to come into the state from the recovery package, specifically for childcare through CCDF that passed at the end of 2020 in December. But the new administration has proposals that a proposal that is inclusive has about what, Harriet, 40 billion specifically for childcare.
Yeah.
Kind of thinking about two pots, one through CCDF, so very similar to the money that we've received before, and the other related to childcare stabilization. And so I think, again, I really believe, in particular with facilities and capital projects, I think that both that package and infrastructure would be really important. And then I also don't want to, and elevating that as a priority and as a need. I think what we've been hearing, and I'm sure you all are hearing a lot of very similar things, we're approaching the sort of same number, like a pre-pandemic number of facilities, but we have about half of the capacity. And I think a lot of that is having to do with loss of centers. So that's going to go right at the heart of, you know, what does that mean? And there's a lot that we don't know right now. And again, you know, Katie and others, you may know more, but, you know, have people lost leases? Do they need to find new commercial space? Do they need to invest in renovating some of those spaces? Where are some of our home-based providers or license exempt providers? Where can they expand in their homes, right? As we start to think about bumping out garages or additions or things like that, really to be able to grow supply. So I think that there's a lot there. That we need to really lift up. And I think getting, you know, growing obviously all types of providers. I think, you know, public schools obviously expanding, you know, George has talked about a lot of co-locating. I think those kind of solutions and innovations that we've been seeing in the communities are things that we want to probably lift up. And really, I don't think we're getting enough attention to probably how important sort of capital projects are going to be in supply building and growing supply. So definitely wanted to put that out there. Not, you know, a lot of the money, again, again, as we know, for Head Start, early Head Start, early intervention, early childhood special education, Part B and C of IDEA, I think that funding stream in particular probably has not gotten some of the attention to date in the recovery efforts. And we know from even some of our own data, U of O has been tracking, we've seen probably quite, and this is national data, George and others probably more closely connected to their ESDs and local systems of EC services can attest to the services have been very disruptive and very complicated to figure out in this virtual world, right? How to continue to connect with families and deliver those services. So I think lifting those up, there's child welfare funds, and then obviously Head Start, early Head Start expansion has seen some money. In terms of the how, one, I think a lot of you have different relationships with your Oregon congressional delegation, or I say Katie putting in the chamber. I think Dana and some of our advocates sit at other national tables will have ideas, but I think it's, directly kind of to the administration, to leadership once it's established in the agencies, and then always working through our congressional delegation. I think in particular, we've had some federal congressional representatives and our senators from the state that have been particularly vocal about childcare. So I think it's they are a great asset to build on. We could talk about letters. I think some of your one-on-ones and talking about individual meetings helps and goes a long way as well, especially if you want to be feeding them like solutions and things that you've been seeing that are working.
Miriam, can I add just one thing on an issue that you all talked about, which was facilities, and these issues of facilities and of our major federal early childhood streams, the only one that really allows for capital expenditure is Head Start. And it's actually a direct prohibition in the child care funding stream. So the $15 billion that the president has proposed for ongoing permanent addition in the hope for next round for childcare, if it goes into the law as it exists, still has a bar in that. So I just wanted to emphasize that so that there's a good understanding here that as people are grappling with these profound issues around quality and supply for childcare, that amongst the many still problems is raising the voice around a meaningful capital approach, because there isn't really one there's only one for Head Start, and it's highly entrepreneurial and terrifically difficult for people working in the other areas. And George obviously can talk about school financing, where we've done a little better on buildings.
Is there a way, this might be up Peter's alley too, just the infrastructure, and so just that concept of infrastructure grants or competitive grants and things that take place at the federal level, but also if there was bills or there was things similar to how school districts can do bonds, and again, or even have even for schools here with the matching bond grants, where even if we raise up to 4 million, we can have a matching bond of the other 4 million. Just there could be bills that pass or things that take place that make it a little bit easier for facilities to be created.
Right. And I think, George, exactly. I think asking more specifically about, will the stabilization fund for childcare allow for use for capital projects, and asking those kinds of questions as well, kind of at the federal level of those, are there bills or things that, and we can, again, some of our terrific advocates in the state have those networks nationally as well, where they are tracking some of those opportunities. I feel like I forgot two really important ones, funding stream wise. One is obviously we have a federal funding stream for home visiting and tribal home visiting programs that comes into our state through Health and Human Services. I think we've talked a lot about family support, social emotional support. A number of those programs really emphasize that. So I think that would be another thing to look at. And then I know that there's significant talk about significant funds for Title I increases that would go directly to school districts, and those again can be used to support preschool education.
The last thing I want to add, and I know we have to open it back up, just remind you all that part of Raise Up Oregon, actually you drew quite a bit of attention to the issue of working cooperatively with the housing agency to try to stimulate more within housing of housing childcare connection. And just a reminder, you know, and it feels like you have a great advocate in the housing agency to continue to cultivate and to work on that with. There was a great deal of openness around that. And there is a component part within Raise Up Oregon already trying to address this important connection. So with that, should we open
Harriet,
it back up?
Harriet, let me ask Miriam a quick question. Isn't there already $100 million of new money coming to Oregon, regardless of this new stimulus package for childcare?
Yes.
And can that be used for this facility issue that we're talking about?
No.
No.
It's about shaping the next one. Yeah, that one is going through CCDF, and that's the prohibition that Harriet talked about.
It's you can use it for data systems, all kinds of things. And there are ways you can help facilities get things, but you cannot do facilities. It's an absolute bar in the federal legislation. And there's not a waiver provision for that, as far as I know.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, so we've had a big conversation, ideas from people, reactions to things that colleagues shared in terms of priorities, ideas of actions for you all to take.
Yeah, this is Angie. I do want to go back to priorities just for a moment, because I think, you know, kind of reading through the priorities, we have some really immediate big needs that are really visible. And going through, I didn't want to name every single 21. I think there are 21, but they are. Somebody else said, how do we decide what's less important here than others? They're all very important. I think I pulled out some things that were real immediate, big visible items, but I don't want to lose sight of, I think it was number 4. I can't remember what it was, but I don't want to lose sight of the mission or the vision to develop in the long term a statewide agency for early learning. I do think that's critical, and I do think that's really important for this body. If not us, then who is going to be really advancing that? So I felt like I wanted to come back and put that on the record. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Angie. George, did you have something else you were going to add?
No, I was going to share that concept that I talked with you about. If we were to do kind of a town hall, and it was facilitated, and folks brought in key stakeholders, and then we had different questions about the legislative priorities, or we basically had an agenda that covered different things, and we could do breakout groups, and then somebody could facilitate the ideas, and we would write down their thoughts. And that's if we were going to, again, engage stakeholders and get their thoughts and ideas, and really try to hear what they had to say. And in that context, you could also communicate that to legislatures, to senators, to representatives, and really kind of convey exactly what folks are saying. But that's that town hall format that potentially would be a communication gathering or a data gathering moment.
Yeah, good idea, George. Yeah. That could be a function. And we'll talk about the town hall concept in February, right, Carrie?
Yeah.
Before we turn things over to Carrie to summarize, any other thoughts? I see in the chat that Anne endorsed what Angie said about the governance issue also needing to be resolved and being important. Okay, Sue, are you okay with Carrie doing her summary wrap up?
Yeah,
okay,
great.
Carrie.
Thanks, Carrie. Thank you, Harriet.
Thank you to all of you.
So what I did when I was taking notes, and can you see my document? I have too many documents open, so. So for the first question, what I captured is kind of 4 major strategies for us to think about of the way that the council as a whole and individual members can share the priorities. And so there's definitely the work that we can do with the congressional delegation as a council and what kind of communication we want to have. And then there's individual council members share their relationships. And there was a lot of focus early on in the conversation about the state legislature and other stakeholder groups that you're a member of that can create some momentum and alignment around the shared priorities. And then we ended with additional individual relationships with congressional. So really thinking about both federal and state. You're going to invite potentially the Early Childhood Coalition to share their agenda and strategies with you at the February meeting. And then our discussion in February can also be about the town hall and the multiple potential purposes of it. And there's one of it around communications and stakeholder engagement that helps move the priorities forward. I did a tally just to get a sense of like the repeat of like what was brought up across the conversation. So congratulations, you took the 21 priorities and felt like an emphasis around 12 of them. So I think you did better than I would have necessarily expected. So you can kind of—
Carrie,
Yeah.
Carrie, will you enlarge the screen a little bit?
Yeah, I can do that.
Thanks. Thank you.
Let's see. I realize, oh, I know what I did. Does that help? Is that bigger?
Maybe. How's that look, Angie? Yeah.
Okay. So
Sounds good.
Yeah.
Thanks, Carrie.
So I think it may be less important necessarily number of votes. I was starting to think about and didn't quite finish how would some of these be grouped together. So obviously the focus on the models for early care and ed funding, compensation, and then seeing here the early learning agency, reducing silos, supply building, facilities. I mean, I think there's some things all around the childcare and the early care and ed and what has COVID and the wildfires have done to it and what's our opportunity to strengthen it and what we need it to look like going forward. And then there was this real resonant conversation that many of you had around the mental health consultation and workforce. So I was trying to start to group them because I think I'm less worried about like actual number of votes and how would we eventually give this back to you and some key of how we would group some of the priorities for you. And then I captured some of the key talking points as people were kind of describing their why about thinking about the immediate impact and urgency that COVID and wildfires have created for our most vulnerable families. We have immediate big needs. This is the time to seize the moment around our early care and ed providers, and really this concern that as we start to get more access to families, as the vaccines roll out, as programs open up, we probably are all anticipating this overwhelming issue around social emotional well-being and what's our proactive supports to providers and families, and are they going to know where they can go and what can we be putting in place in the programs that exist right now. So that's what I've captured from our conversation today.
Carrie, will you? Yeah. Scroll up there from our scroll. Yeah. So that there. You know, one possibility, and council, let me know what you think of this, is to have staff, and I guess that means David, Remy, and Troy, look at these priorities and then come back and tell us if there are bills that have been introduced that are addressing those, because then we'd be able to be specific in where we may want to weigh in, either testifying or communicating with legislators or whatever, just on a state level at least. So would that be?
Sue, I just want to totally endorse that, because I'd love to have there be a cross tab between what we see as our priorities and where there are opportunities that the staff can tell us about at the state level or maybe even at the federal level. So I totally think that's the right way to go. Just want to endorse that.
Okay, thanks, Dan. Thanks.
Sue, if I could just add real quick, on this, the very last one, expand ECSE services. Actually, Coley and I both had commented on that in the chat, and so I think both it should actually be 3 because there was one.
It should be 3, Carrie. I agree, Angie. I
you.
have some other notes I was going to share with Carrie that would change because I tried to track. There's a little more
great.
repetition, Carrie, but we can go over that later.
Right. And I think less about repetition and more about how would we group these?
Yeah.
And then how would they be mapped against what Sue and Ann were just talking about of what's actual legislative bills or have budget implications for your state process right now.
Yeah. And, you know, each of us is involved in other coalitions and alliances, and, you know, you've got FBO and their tribal networks and stuff. So to the extent we can, just in the next 2 weeks before our council meeting, look at where do our priorities align with some of these other networks that we're involved in. It might be informative just to say, here are our allies. And you know, if we have Dana come and present the coalition list, we'll certainly see a lot of overlap there. But it's just another thought of how do we sort of enlarge our footprint in a way, if you want to call it that. So does that make sense, Carrie?
Yeah.
As we look ahead to
No,
February.
Right, exactly.
It feels like there's a good path forward. There's a lot of consensus and good ideas about how to shape next steps, basically in the coming months, both to work with people who will be making decisions for the state of Oregon and also for people who will be making decisions for the United States.
Mm-hmm. Yes, yes. So let's be sure to look at both federal and state level. Mm-hmm. So I think that's a pathway forward on the legislative piece. And I know we've got 2 minutes. Is there anything council members want to throw out as far as follow up from the hub conversation that we had today? Because we have been talking about having time on our February agenda to have more of a conversation with hubs, with some hub representatives, potentially, you know, governance council members, family voice, stakeholders, whatever. But I'm just wondering, are there any quick reactions to what would you like to hear more about with hubs? And the theory of change and CCR&Rs, any of that?
I guess I just think my big question is how do we create a statewide policy, philosophy, and structure that is also deeply responsive to what communities have, are, and their capacity. And I don't know how to have that conversation because I think that's a really important state, local level alignment that we need to have, but it's a tension that has to be worked out. And I don't know what to do with that. I'm just throwing it out there as an issue.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, good. Thanks, Ann. Very important. Any other thoughts on the hubs? Next steps? Okay, I know, we're all brain dead. Okay. Thank you all for an amazing afternoon. Great input, great conversation. Each of you is doing wonderful work where you are. Harriet and Carrie, thank you as always for helping facilitate this. Remy, nice going in organizing all of us and this, yes, event. And 2 weeks from today, we'll have the second half of this meeting. So stay tuned. And if you do have any other comments about what you'd like to see happen at our February 10th meeting, please just send them to me before tomorrow morning at 9:30 when we put that agenda together. Thanks you all. Have a great evening. Miriam, hope you're doing well with all your testifying.